In the sleepy village of St. Mary Mead, a wealthy newcomer drops dead at his own dinner party, poisoned under the noses of 7 guests. Top inspectors are stumped. No fingerprints, no witnesses, just a web of secrets and lies. But Miss Marple, with her sharp eyes and knack for human nature, sees what they miss. As motives unraveled, greed, revenge, hidden love, she weaves through a maze of clues to unmask a cunning killer in a shocking twist that restores peace to the village. Chapter 1: The Village Scandal. The morning sun crept over the rolling hills of St. Mary Mead, casting a golden glow on the thatched roofs and neat hedgerows that defined the village's timeless charm. Miss Jane Marple sat by her window, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically, her sharp eyes scanning the familiar scene beyond her lace curtains. The postman cycled past, a milk cart rattled down the lane, and Mrs. Price from the grocer's waved to a neighbor. It was a picture of tranquility, the kind of serene order that St. Mary Mead prided itself on. Yet, as Miss Marple knew better than most, beneath such calm surfaces often lurked the most unexpected ripples. Her gaze lingered on the grand outline of Hawthorne Manor, a newcomer to the village's landscape, its imposing stone walls and tall chimneys standing in stark contrast to the modest cottages around it. The manor belonged to Mr. Reginald Hawthorne, a wealthy industrialist who had arrived 6 months prior, bringing with him a whirlwind of speculation and curiosity. A widower in his late 50s, with a reputation for both charm and ruthlessness, he had purchased the estate with plans to retire in style, or so he claimed. The villagers, however, were less convinced, their tongues wagging with tales of his business dealings, his sharp temper, and the parade of guests who came and went from the manor's iron gates. Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by a sharp rap at her door. She set her knitting aside and rose, smoothing her skirt. It was Dolly Bantry, her old friend, whose flushed cheeks and wide eyes betrayed an urgency that was rare for so early an hour. "Jane, you'll never believe it," Dolly burst out, barely waiting to be invited in. "There's been a death at Hawthorne Manor. Mr. Hawthorne himself found dead this morning in his library." Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted slightly, though her composure remained unshaken. "Dead, you say? How dreadful! Do come in, Dolly, and tell me everything." They settled in the parlor, where Dolly, fanning herself with a handkerchief, recounted the morning's gossip with the fervor of one delivering a royal proclamation. Mr. Hawthorne had hosted a dinner party the previous evening, attended by a select group of guests from both the village and beyond. Sometime after midnight, a maid had discovered his body slumped in an armchair, a glass of wine spilled across the rug, his face contorted in a grimace of pain. The doctor had been summoned, and word was spreading that poison was suspected. The police were already at the manor, and the village was alight with speculation. "It's positively ghastly," Dolly said, her voice trembling with excitement rather than fear. "They say it's murder, Jane. Murder, right here in St. Mary Mead. Who could have done such a thing?" Miss Marple's lips pursed thoughtfully. "People are capable of all sorts, Dolly, as you well know. But tell me, who was at this dinner party? I dare say the answer lies there." Dolly leaned forward, eager to share the details she'd gleaned from her maid, who had a cousin working at the manor. The guest list was a curious mix. Dr. Henry Simmons, the village's new physician, known for his charm but rumored to have a gambling habit. Mrs. Evelyn Langley, a widow with a sharp tongue and a history of friction with Hawthorne. Tom Hawthorne, the victim's nephew and heir, a young man with grand ambitions but little patience. Miss Clara Ellis, the shy governess to Hawthorne's late sister's children, who had been retained at the manor. And Mr. Percival Vance, an eccentric artist whose disputes with Hawthorne over a land deal were the talk of the village. There were also a few minor figures, butler, a cook, and a pair of maids, but the focus, Dolly insisted, was on the main guests. Miss Marple nodded, her mind already sifting through the names, each one a thread in the tapestry of human nature she so expertly unraveled. A varied group, she murmured. And the police, what are they saying? They're baffled, Jane, absolutely baffled. Inspector Craddock is there, and I heard they've called in some bigwig from Scotland Yard, a Chief Inspector Langley. No relation to Mrs. Langley, mind you. They're combing the place for clues, but so far, nothing. The poison was in the wine, they think, but no one saw a thing. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. No one ever sees anything, Dolly, until one knows where to look. I think I shall take a stroll toward the manor this afternoon. The air will do me good, and one never knows what one might overhear. Dolly stared at her friend, a mix of admiration and exasperation in her eyes. Jane, you're incorrigible. You'll have this solved before the police have finished their tea, won't you? Miss Marple smiled demurely. I only observe, Dolly. People are much the same, whether in St. Mary Mead or London. Now, would you like a cup of tea before you go? By noon, the village was a hive of activity. Miss Marple, armed with her straw hat and a basket of garden cuttings as an excuse for her wanderings, made her way toward Hawthorne Manor. The lane was busier than usual, with villagers lingering near the manor's gates, whispering and craning their necks to catch a glimpse of the police activity. A constable stood guard, his expression stern, but Miss Marple's unassuming presence allowed her to pass unnoticed, her basket swinging gently as she nodded politely to passers-by. The manor itself was a grand affair, its ivy-clad walls and tall windows exuding an air of aloof grandeur. Miss Marple paused at the edge of the garden, where roses bloomed in orderly rows, and observed the comings and goings. A police car was parked near the entrance, and she spotted Inspector Duke, a familiar face from past cases, speaking animatedly with a tall, silver-haired man she presumed to be Chief Inspector Langley. Their furrowed brows suggested frustration, and Miss Marple's lips twitched in a faint smile. The professionals, it seemed, were already at a loss. She wandered closer, pretending to admire the roses, and caught snatches of conversation from a pair of maids huddled near the kitchen door. It was the wine, they're saying, one whispered, poured from the same decanter as everyone else's, but only his glass was poisoned. How's that possible? Maybe it was meant for someone else, the other replied, her voice low. Or maybe it was that nephew of his, always skulking about, that one. Miss Marple moved on, her mind turning over the details. Poison in a single glass, yet poured from a shared decanter. A puzzle, indeed, and one that required precision, an opportunity. She recalled a similar incident years ago in St. Mary Mead, when a jealous suitor had tampered with a teacup at a church fete. The key had been timing and nerve. As she circled the manor's perimeter, she noticed Dr. Simmons emerging from a side door, his face pale and his hands fidgeting with his coat buttons. He glanced around nervously before hurrying toward the village. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Dr. Simmons, she knew, had a reputation for charm, but also for debts. A man in financial trouble was often a man with secrets. Further along, she spotted Mrs. Langley in the garden, her black dress stark against the bright flowers. She was speaking sharply to a gardener, her voice carrying a note of indignation. He had no right to treat people that way, she snapped. No right at all. Miss Marple wondered if the he was Hawthorne, and what grievances lay beneath. Mrs. Langley's composed exterior by the time Miss Marple returned home. Her basket was fuller than intended, thanks to a kindly gardener who insisted on sharing clippings. She settled into her armchair, her knitting resumed, and her mind sifted through the morning's observations. The dinner party, the poison, the guest's each piece was a fragment of a larger picture. She thought of Tom Hawthorne, the nephew whose ambition might outweigh his loyalty, of Miss Ellis, whose quiet demeanor could mask deeper emotions, of Mr. Vance, whose artistic temperament might conceal a calculating mind. And then there was the manor itself, a place of secrets and shadows. The afternoon brought another visitor, Inspector Craddock, looking weary but determined. "Miss Marple," he said, accepting a cup of tea, "I don't suppose you've heard the gossip about Hawthorne's death." "I've heard a little," she replied modestly. "A dreadful business. Poison, they say." Craddock nodded. "Arsenic, the doctor thinks, though we're waiting on the full report. It was in his wine, but the decanter and other glasses are clean. It's as if the poison appeared out of nowhere." Miss Marple's needles paused. "Nowhere is a very unlikely place, Inspector. Someone must have placed it there, and someone must have had a reason." Craddock sighed. "That's the trouble. Everyone at that dinner had a reason. Tom Hawthorne stands to inherit a fortune. Mrs. Langley had a falling out with the victim years ago, something about a broken engagement. Dr. Simmons owed him money, a substantial sum. Miss Ellis was terrified of losing her position. And Vance, well, he and Hawthorne were at odds over a land deal that could have made Vance rich." "A crowded field," Miss Marple murmured. "But motives are only part the story. Tell me, Inspector, was the glass found with the body?" Craddock frowned. "That's the odd thing. The glass was there, spilled across the rug, but it's gone now. We've searched the manor, top to bottom. It's as if someone took it." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "Or replaced it, perhaps. A clean glass in place of a poisoned one. It's the sort of thing one might do in a hurry, don't you think?" Craddock stared at her, then scribbled a note. "You've got a way of seeing things, Miss Marple. I'll have the team double-check the dining room." As he left, Miss Marple returned to her knitting, her mind weaving a pattern of its own. The missing glass was a clue, but not the only one. She thought of the maid's whispers, Dr. Simmons's nervous glance, Mrs. Langley's sharp words, and she thought of St. Mary Mead, where secrets were never as well hidden as their owners believed. The day wore on, and the village settled into an uneasy quiet. Miss Marple, however, was far from idle. She made discreet inquiries through her network of friends and neighbors, learning that Tom Hawthorne had been seen arguing with his uncle the day before the dinner, that Miss Ellis had been crying in the churchyard, and that Mr. Vance had purchased a bottle of cleaning fluid from the chemiston, odd choice for an artist. Each tidbit was a thread, and Miss Marple was patient in gathering them by evening. As the sun dipped below the hills, she sat by her fire, her knitting abandoned for the moment. The puzzle was taking shape, though it was far from complete. Poisoned glass, a missing clue, a room full of suspects, each with a motive, each with a secret. She thought of a similar case from years ago, when a village girl had poisoned her lover's tea out of desperation. The key had been not the act, but the moment of opportunity. Miss Marple rose and lit a lamp, her mind clear. She would attend the Women's Institute meeting tomorrow, where tongues would surely loosen further. In the meantime, she would watch and listen, as she always did. The truth, she knew, was there, hidden in the ordinary details of St. Mary Mead's daily life. And Jane Marple was never one to let the truth slip by unnoticed. Chapter 2. The Baffled Inspectors. The morning after Mr. Reginald Hawthorne's death. St. Mary Mead was a hive of whispers and speculation. The village, usually a picture of pastoral calm, with its neat cottages and winding lanes, seemed to hum with a nervous energy. The news of the wealthy newcomer's demise in his grand manor had spread like wildfire, igniting conversations in the local pub, the grocer's shop, and even the churchyard, where the vicar's wife was overheard murmuring about dreadful goings-on. By noon, the arrival of Scotland Yard's Inspector Craddock had only fanned the flames of curiosity. His black car, sleek and out of place among the village's more modest vehicles, rolled up the gravel drive to Hawthorne Manor, drawing a small crowd of onlookers who lingered at a respectful distance, their eyes sharp with interest. Inspector Craddock, a man in his early 40s, with a lean build and a face that suggested both determination and weariness. His reputation preceded him, a dogged investigator who had solved a string of complex cases in London, though St. Mary Mead's quaint mysteries were a new terrain for him. He was joined shortly by another figure, Chief Inspector Langley, a renowned detective whose name carried weight in police circles. Langley was older, with a shock of gray hair and a manner that exuded authority, though his sharp eyes betrayed a flicker of frustration as he surveyed the manor. The two men exchanged a brief nod before entering the imposing stone building, its ivy-covered walls and tall windows giving it an air of grandeur that seemed almost theatrical against the village's simplicity. Inside, the manor's library, where Hawthorne had been found slumped in a leather armchair, was cordoned off. The room was a study in opulence, oak-paneled walls lined with shelves of leather-bound books, a crystal chandelier catching the morning light, and a long mahogany table where the dinner party had taken place. The air still carried a faint trace of the previous night's wine, now mingled with the metallic tang of investigative equipment. A constable stood guard, his face pale as he recounted the scene to Craddock and Langley. "Found him just there, sir," he said, pointing to the armchair, glass of wine on the table beside him, half drunk. "Itself?" he asked, his voice clipped. "Sent to the lab, sir," the constable replied. "But it's odd, there's no trace of anything unusual in the room. No spilled wine, no fingerprints on the bottle or decanter that don't belong to the guests or staff." Langley frowned, his gaze sweeping the room. "Poison, then," he said, more to himself than to Craddock. "Anyone noticing?" Craddock stood, brushing his hands together. "That's the puzzle. 5 guests, all with access to the wine, all with reasons to dislike Hawthorne, from what I've gathered. Yet no one saw a thing." The inspectors had already been briefed on the dinner party attendees, a group as varied as the village itself. Dr. Simmons, the charming local physician, had been a frequent guest at the manor, his easy smile masking a rumored financial strain. Mrs. Langley, no relation to the chief inspector, was a widow whose cool demeanor and sharp tongue had made her a figure of intrigue in St. Mary Mead. Tom Hawthorne, the victim's nephew, was a young man with ambitions that far outstripped his current means, his eyes always darting as if calculating his next move. Miss Ellis, the governess employed by Hawthorne to tutor his distant cousin's children, was quiet and unassuming, her presence almost forgettable until one noticed her watchful gaze. And then there was Mr. Vance, the eccentric artist whose flamboyant scarves and wild gestures made him a standout. "Let's run through it again," he said. Dinner began at 7. The guests were seated around this table. Wine was poured from a single decanter, served by the butler, who swears he didn't tamper with it. The poison was in Hawthorne's glass, but no one else was affected. So either the killer poisoned the glass directly, or they tampered with the decanter and somehow ensured only Hawthorne drank the fatal dose. Craddock nodded, his brow furrowed. The butler's story checks out so far. He poured the wine, left the room to fetch dessert, and returned to find Hawthorne collapsing. The guests all confirm they were seated, talking among themselves. Number 1 admits to touching the decanter or Hawthorne's glass. And yet, Langley said, stopping to face Craddock, someone did. We're dealing with someone clever, someone who planned this meticulously. The inspectors spent the next hour combing the library for clues, but the room yielded little. The decanter, now in evidence, was a heavy crystal piece, its surface wiped clean except for smudges, consistent with the butler's and Tom Hawthorne's fingerprints. The other glasses on the table were unremarkable, each containing traces of the same red wine, none showing signs of poison. The dining room, adjacent to the library, was equally unhelpful. No hidden vials, no suspicious stains, no signs of anything amiss. The manor's staff, a small team of a cook, a maid, and the butler, were questioned, but their stories aligned. They had been busy in the kitchen or serving, with no opportunity to slip into the library unnoticed. As the day wore on, Craddock and Langley interviewed the guests, hoping to uncover a crack in their stories. Dr. Simmons was first, his manner polished but strained. "I was seated across from Hawthorne," he said, his hands folded neatly in his lap. "We were discussing his plans for the manor-some grand renovation he had in mind. I didn't notice anything unusual about his glass or the wine. He seemed perfectly fine until he suddenly clutched his chest and fell forward." Langley leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "And you, a doctor, didn't think to check on him immediately?" Simmons flushed slightly. "Of course I did. I rushed to his side, but it was clear he was beyond help. The symptoms, convulsions, the smell of almonds on his breath, pointed to poison. I told the butler to call for help at once." Elegance. "I barely spoke to Reginald that evening," she said, her voice cool. "He was preoccupied with Tom, as usual, discussing the estate. I was talking to Miss Ellis about her work with the children. I didn't see anyone near his glass." Tom Hawthorne was less composed, his hands fidgeting as he spoke. "I poured wine for everyone earlier in the evening," he admitted. "Uncle Reginald liked me to take charge of things like that, but I didn't touch his glass after that. Why would I? He was my ticket to a better life." Miss Ellis, pale and soft-spoken, seemed on the verge of tears. I was just there to make up the numbers, she said. Mr. Hawthorne insisted I join the dinner, though I felt out of place. I didn't notice anything wrong with the wine or his glass. I was too nervous to pay much attention. Mr. Vance, by contrast, was theatrical, his hands waving as he recounted his evening. I was telling a story about my latest painting, he said, his eyes gleaming. A landscape inspired by the hills around St. Mary Mead. Hawthorne wasn't impressed. Of course, he never was. But I was nowhere near his glass. I was at the far end of the table, lost in my own brilliance. By late afternoon, Craddock and Langley were no closer to an answer. The guests' stories, while not identical, were consistent enough to frustrate any attempt to pinpoint a suspect. The lack of physical evidence was maddening. The missing glass, the clean decanter, the absence of any obvious method for delivering the poison. Langley, usually unflappable, slammed a notebook onto the table in the Manor's drawing room, where they had set up a temporary base. This is impossible, he said. We have 5 people with access, 5 people with motives, and not a single piece of evidence that points to one over the others. Craddock, leaning against a window, looked out at the village below. Maybe we're looking at it wrong, he said slowly. Maybe it's not about what we can see, but what we can't. Someone went to great lengths to cover their tracks. That missing glass seed's the key, isn't it? If we could figure out how it was swapped, we'd know who had the opportunity. Langley nodded, though his expression remained grim. Tom stands to inherit a fortune. Mrs. Langley had some old grudge against Hawthorne, something about a public slight years ago. Simmons was in debt to him, and Hawthorne wasn't the forgiving type. Miss Ellis was terrified of losing her job, and Vance and Hawthorne were at each other's throats over that land deal. Any one of them could have done it. Craddock sighed, running a hand through his hair. We need something concrete, a witness, a fingerprint, anything. Otherwise, we're just chasing shadows. As the inspectors debated their next move, Miss Jane Marple sat quietly in her cottage on the edge of the village, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically. She had not been invited to the Manor that morning, but news traveled fast in St. Mary. Mead and her maid, Cherry, had already relayed the morning's developments in vivid detail. Miss Marple listened, her mild blue eyes fixed on her knitting, but her mind was elsewhere, turning over the details of the dinner party, the guests, and the asterisk. She had known Reginald Hawthorne only by reputation, a man of wealth and ambition, but not one to make friends easily. His arrival in St. Mary Mead had been a topic of much discussion, his grand plans for the manor and the surrounding land stirring both excitement and unease among the villagers. Miss Marple had observed him at church, noting his stiff posture and the way his eyes seemed to assess everyone around him, as if calculating their worth. She had also noted the way the dinner party guests interacted with him, their smiles polite but strained, their conversations laced with undercurrents of tension. Now, as she sat in her cozy parlor, Miss Marple considered the puzzle before her. Poison in a glass of wine, administered in a room full of people, yet unseen. A missing glass, replaced with a clean one. 5 guests, each with a reason to wish Hawthorne dead. It was, she thought, not unlike a case she had once heard of in St. Mary Mead, many years ago, when a local merchant had died under mysterious circumstances, his tea laced with arsenic. The solution, then, had lain not in the evidence the police could see, but in the small human details. They had overlooked the way a maid's hands trembled when she poured tea, the way a guest lingered too long near the table. Miss Marple set her knitting aside and rose, moving to the window to look out at the village. The manor loomed in the distance, its chimneys just visible above the trees. She thought of Inspector Craddock, a capable man, but perhaps too focused on the mechanics of the crime, fingerprints, timelines, physical evidence, and Chief Inspector Langley, with his sharp mind and sharper temper, was likely to miss the subtleties of human nature that so often revealed the truth. They would need help, she decided, though they would not thank her for it. She returned to her chair, picking up her knitting once more. As her needles resumed their steady rhythm, her mind worked through the problem, piecing together the fragments of what she knew: the poison, the glass, the guests, the motives. It was a puzzle, yes, but not an unsolvable one. In St. Mary Mead, secrets had a way of surfacing like ripples in a pond, and Miss Marple had always been adept at noticing the smallest disturbances. Meanwhile, back at the manor, Craddock and Langley were preparing to re-interview the guests, hoping a second round of questions might shake loose a new detail. The sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the lawn, and the village was settling into its evening routine. But for the inspectors, the day was far from over. They were determined to crack the case, unaware that a quiet spinster in a cottage nearby was already several steps ahead, her mind weaving a net that would, in time, catch the killer. The interviews continued into the evening, each guest repeating their story with slight variations that only deepened the prostation's frustration. Dr. Simmons was more guarded this time, his charm tinged with defensiveness. Mrs. Langley's cool reserve seemed to harden her answers, clipped and precise. Tom Hawthorne's nervousness had grown, his hands shaking as he insisted on his innocence. Miss Ellis was quieter, her eyes darting to the door as if she longed to escape. And Mr. Vance, ever the showman, embellished his tale with new flourishes, though his alibi remained shaky. As night fell, Craddock stood outside the manor, lighting a cigarette and staring at the stars. "We're missing something," he said to Langley, who had joined him. "Something obvious." "I can feel it," Langley grunted, his face half hidden in the dark. "Maybe, or maybe we're dealing with a ghost. No prints, no witnesses, no glass. It's like the crime never happened." Craddock exhaled a plume of smoke. "It happened, and someone in that room knows how. We just have to find the right thread to pull." Inside the manor, the library remained silent, its secrets locked within its walls. But in St. Mary Mead, secrets never stayed hidden for long, not when Miss Marple was watching. Chapter 3. The dinner party guests. The evening sun dipped below the rolling hills of St. Mary Mead. The air was thick with the scent of blooming roses and freshly cut grass, but beneath this serene veneer, his grand manor, a stately Georgian structure with ivy-clad walls and tall chimneys, the news of his poisoning during a lavish dinner party had spread like wildfire, and now every tongue in St. Mary Mead wagged with speculation. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her modest drawing-room with its chintz curtains and polished oak furniture, sipped her tea and listened to the chatter filtering in from the village. Her friend, Mrs. Dolly Bantry, had just returned from the post office, her face flushed with the excitement of gossip. "Oh, Jane," she said, settling into a cushioned chair, "the whole village is in a tizzy. Such a scandal, despite her advancing years, twinkled behind her spectacles. But scandals, Dolly, are often like tangled wool. Pull the right thread, and the whole thing unravels. Well, there was Dr. Simmons, of course, the new doctor in the village. Charming man, they say, though I hear he's not as prosperous as he'd like folks to believe. Past. Tom Hawthorne, Reginald's nephew, was there too, all smiles and ambition. They say he's set to inherit the estate, you know. Oh, and Miss Ellis, the governess for the late Mrs. Hawthorne's children, quiet as a mouse, that one, and Mr. Vance, the artist, who's always going on about his paintings. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her fingers absently smoothing the lace doily on the armrest, and each with their own reasons for being there, no doubt. It's curious how a dinner party can bring such different souls together, and how one glass of wine can change everything. Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened. You don't think one of them did it, do you, Jane? I mean, they're all respectable folk in their way. Respectability, Dolly, is a mask somewhere better than others, Miss Marple replied with a faint smile. Now, let's see what we can learn about these guests. Everyone playing their part, but sometimes the script hides more than it reveals. As the village clock chimed 6, Miss Mind began to work, piecing together the fragments of information she'd gathered. She had not been at the dinner party herself. Of course, her quiet life of knitting and gardening. The guests, as Mrs. Bantry described them, were a fascinating cast, each with their own quirks and secrets. Dr. Haydock, who had retired to Bournemouth. He was a man in his early 40s, with a handsome face, a quick smile, and a manner that put patients at ease. The villagers had taken to him at once, charmed by his easy conversation and apparent dedication to their ailments. But Miss Marple had heard whispers, nothing concrete, mind you, but enough to pique her interest. There was talk of unpaid bills at the chemist's. At the dinner party, Dr. Simmons had been seated to Mr. Hawthorne's right, a position of honor that suggested a close acquaintance. Had he poured the fatal glass of wine, or had he merely been close enough to notice something amiss? A tall, elegant woman in her 50s, she carried herself with a certain aloofness that some mistook for arrogance. Her late husband, a solicitor, had left her comfortable but not wealthy. Yet, Mrs. Bantry had mentioned a rumor that Mrs. Langley and Mr. Hawthorne had known each other years ago. Before his wealth and her widowhood, there was a story there, Miss Marple thought, perhaps one of old wounds or unrequited feelings. At the dinner, Mrs. Langley had been seated across from Hawthorne, her cool gaze fixed on him more than once, according to the maid who'd served the meal. Had that gaze held resentment or something deeper? Tom Hawthorne, the victim's nephew, was another puzzle. A young man of 25, with sharp features and an eager demeanor. He had come to St. Mary Mead only 6 months ago, ostensibly to assist his uncle with the estate. But Miss Marple had seen his type before, ambitious, restless, always looking for the next opportunity. The village gossips said Tom stood to inherit Hawthorne Manor, a prize that would make any young man's head turn. At the dinner, he had been attentive, pouring wine for the guests with a flourish, his laughter ringing out over the table. Miss Marple recalled a young man from St. Mary Mead's past, a nephew who'd smiled just as brightly while plotting to secure his inheritance. History, she knew, had a way of repeating itself. Miss Clara Ellis, the governess, was perhaps the least conspicuous of the group. A slight, pale woman in her late 20s. Miss Ellis was rarely seen in the village, her days spent within the manor's walls, teaching lessons or reading in the library. At the dinner party she had been quiet, her eyes downcast, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Yet Miss Marple knew that quietness could hide a multitude of emotions. Had Miss Ellis harbored a grudge against her employer? There was something about her, Miss Marple thought, that reminded her of a timid girl from her youth who had surprised everyone with her courage when pushed too far. Finally, whose colorful scarves and dramatic gestures made him a figure of curiosity in St. Mary Mead. He lived in a small cottage on the outskirts of the village, where he painted landscapes that he claimed were touched by the divine. His disputes with Mr. Hawthorne over a piece of land near the river were no secret. Vance had wanted to build a studio there, but Hawthorne had refused to sell. At the dinner, Vance had been his usual flamboyant self, regaling the guests with tales of his travels. But had his exuberance been a cover for anger? Miss Marple remembered an artist from years ago, a man whose pride had led him to desperate acts when his dreams were thwarted. As Miss Marple sat by her window, watching the last rays of sunlight fade, she considered the dynamics of that fateful dinner party. The manor's dining room, with its long mahogany table and glittering chandelier, would have been a grand setting, but also an intimate one, to act unseen. The wine, poured from a crystal decanter, had been the vehicle for the poison, but how had it been administered? And why had no one noticed? Miss Marple's mind turned to the practicalities, the servants, the layout of the room, the timing of the courses. She would need to speak to the maid, Jenny, who had served that night. Servants, she knew, saw things others missed. The next morning, Miss Marple donned her best hata, sensible black one, with a single feather, and set out for the village. Her first stop was the post office, where Mrs. Murgatroyd, the postmistress, was always ready with a cup of tea and a wealth of information. "Good morning, Miss Marple," Mrs. Murgatroyd said, bustling behind the counter. "Terrible business at the manor, isn't it?" "So I've heard," Miss Marple said, her tone gentle but probing. "You were at the church social last week, weren't you? I believe Dr. Simmons was there, chatting with Mr. Hawthorne. Did they seem friendly?" Dr. Simmons looked a bit strained. "I heard him mention something about a loan, but Mr. Hawthorne just laughed it off. Said something about good investments paying off in time. Not sure what he meant, but Dr. Simmons didn't look pleased." Miss Marple nodded, filing the information away. A loan, perhaps unpaid, could be a powerful motive. She thanked Mrs. Murgatroyd and moved on to the butcher's, where she hoped to catch Jenny, the manor's maid, who often ran errands in the morning. Jenny was a rosy-cheeked girl of 19, with a nervous habit of twisting her apron when she spoke. Miss Marple found her outside the shop, a basket of groceries in her arms. "Good morning, Jenny," Miss Marple said kindly. "I hope you're managing after all this upset at the manor." Jenny's eyes darted around, as if expecting someone to overhear. "It's awful, Miss Marple," she whispered. "Mr. Hawthorne was ever so kind to me, and now he's gone. I don't know what to think." "You were serving at the dinner, weren't you?" Miss Marple asked, her voice soft and encouraging. "It must have been a busy night with all those guests. Did anything strike you as unusual?" Jenny hesitated, then leaned closer. "Well, miss, it's probably nothing, but Mr. Vance spilled his wine early in the evening, and he made such a fuss about it. Insisted on getting a new glass himself from the sideboard. I thought it odd. him being a guest and all. Miss Marple's interest sharpened, but she kept her expression neutral. "How curious," she said. "And the others? Did they seem themselves?" "Mostly," Jenny said. Miss Ellis was quiet, like always, but she kept looking at Mr. Hawthorne when she thought no one noticed. Dr. Simmons was charming, pouring wine for everyone, but he seemed, I don't know, distracted. And Mrs. Langley, she hardly spoke, just stared at her plate. Mr. Tom was the liveliest, laughing and toasting, but it all felt off, somehow. Miss Marple thanked Jenny and continued her walk, her mind buzzing. Vance's spilled wine and insistence on a new glass could be significant, or merely the eccentricity of an artist. Miss Ellis's glances at Hawthorne suggested an emotional connection, perhaps unrequited. Dr. Simmons's distraction and Mrs. Langley's silence were equally telling, and Tom's joviality might hide a calculated plan. Each guest, it seemed, had their own story, their own secrets. By midday, Miss Marple had gathered more snippets from the village. The baker mentioned Mrs. Langley's habit of buying expensive wines, despite her modest means, suggesting a taste for luxury that might have clashed with Hawthorne's wealth. The grocer spoke of Tom Hawthorne's recent purchase of a fine suit, as if preparing for a grand future, and the vicar, in passing, noted that Miss Ellis had been seen crying in the churchyard the day before the dinner, though no one knew why. Back in her cottage, Miss Marple sat with her knitting, the click of her needles a steady rhythm as she thought. The dinner party guests formed a complex tapestry, each thread interwoven with motive and opportunity. Dr. Simmons, with his debts and charm, might have slipped poison into the wine while pouring. Mrs. Langley, with her past and bitterness, could have planned a subtle revenge. Tom, with his inheritance at stake, had the most obvious gain. Miss Ellis, quiet and overlooked, might have acted out of desperation or love. And Vance, with his flair for drama, could have orchestrated a clever ruse. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the wine itself. The poison, Inspector Craddock had said, was a rare one, slow-acting and tasteless, requiring knowledge to obtain and administer. Dr. Simmons, with his medical background, was an obvious suspect, but Miss Marple knew that knowledge could be acquired by others. Mrs. Langley's interest in wines, Tom's ambition, Miss Ellis's access to the Manor's library, and Vance's travels abroad all offered possibilities. The missing glass, too, was a puzzle. Why remove it unless it held a clue, like fingerprints or a trace of the poison? As evening fell, Miss Marple lit a lamp and opened her notebook, jotting down the names of the guests and their quirks. She drew parallels to people she'd known in St. Mary Mead. Dr. Simmons, like the village chemist who'd fallen into debt. Mrs. Langley, like the widow who'd nursed a grudge for years. Tom, like the greedy nephew who'd once caused a stir. Miss Ellis, like the shy girl who'd hidden her strength. And Vance, like the painter who'd lied to save face. These parallels, she knew, were not proof, but they guided her intuition. The village clock struck 9, and Miss Marple closed her notebook. The dinner party guests were a puzzle, but she was beginning to see the shape of it. Tomorrow, she would visit the manor, speak to the butler, and perhaps glimpse the dining room itself. For now, she would let the pieces settle in her mind, like leaves falling into place after a storm. The truth, she felt certain, was there, hidden in the glances, the gestures, and the unspoken tensions of that fateful night. Chapter 4. A Web of Motives. the morning after Mr. Reginald Hawthorne's death. The village of St. Mary Mead was a hive of whispered speculations. The air was thick with the scent of damp grass and the faint tints of autumn leaves, as villagers gathered in small knots outside the post office, the bakery, and the vicarage, their voices low but urgent. The manor, perched on the hill overlooking the village, loomed like a silent sentinel, its windows glinting coldly in the pale sunlight. That Miss Jane Marple found herself most at home, her sharp eyes and sharper mind attuned to the undercurrents of human nature. Miss Marple sat in her small, neat parlor, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she worked on a pale blue shawl. The fire in the hearth cast a warm glow, softening the edges of her modest furniture-worn armchair, a polished oak table, and a shelf of well-read books. Gesturing animatedly to Mr. Cleary, the butcher, they were undoubtedly discussing the scandal at the manor, and Miss Marple's lips twitched into a faint smile. Gossip, she knew, was not merely idle chatter, and in St. Mary Mead, where everyone knew everyone else's business, there was no shortage of such maps. Inspector Craddock had called on her earlier that morning, his face a mixture of frustration and respect. A young man by Scotland Yard standards, with a square jaw and earnest eyes. He had quickly learned that Miss Marple's unassuming demeanor hid a mind as precise as a watchmaker's. He had brought with him Chief Inspector Langley, a man whose reputation preceded him. Langley was older, with a hawk-like nose, and a habit of stroking his chin when deep in thought. He had solved some of London's most perplexing cases. But the poisoning of Reginald Hawthorne was proving to be a thorn in his side. The two inspectors had sat in Miss Marple's parlor, sipping tea she had poured from her best china pot, and outlined the puzzle. "There's simply no clear evidence," Craddock had said, his voice tinged with exasperation. The poison was in the wine-glass cyanide. The lab confirmed, but no one saw it being administered. The glass was on the table, accessible to everyone at the dinner party. "We've interviewed the servants, the guests, even the cook who prepared the meal. Nothing." Langley had nodded, his eyes narrowing. "It's a clever crime. Too clever, perhaps. The killer must have known exactly what they were doing, how to slip the poison in without being noticed, how to blend into the evening's chaos. But we'll find them. There's always a trace." Miss Marple had listened quietly, her needles never pausing. She had offered no immediate theories, only a gentle observation. "People, Inspector, are rarely as clever as they think. They leave traces not in fingerprints or footprints, but in the things they say, the way they look at one another." Now, as she sat by her window, she turned her mind to the dinner party guests, each of whom had been at the manor the night Hawthorne died. There were 5 key figures, each with access to the fatal glass of wine, each with a reason to wish the wealthy newcomer harm. Began to consider each guest in turn, her thoughts as methodical as her knitting. First, there was Dr. Harold Simmons, the village physician, a man in his early 40s, with a charming smile and a bedside manner that had won him the trust of nearly every family in St. Mary Mead. He had been a frequent guest at Hawthorne's table. Simmons was well liked, always ready with a kind word or a witty remark. But Miss Marple had noticed a certain strain in his eyes of late. Inspector Craddock had uncovered that Simmons owed Hawthorne a substantial sum of mania, debt incurred through an ill-advised investment in a medical venture. Hawthorne, it seemed, had been pressing for repayment, and Simmons had no means to settle the account. Miss Marple recalled a village doctor from years past, a man named Dr. Hayworth, who had fallen into debt and resorted to desperate measures to maintain his reputation. Panic. Then there was Mrs. Eleanor Langley, the widow of the late Mr. Charles Langley, a distant cousin of Chief Inspector Langley. Mrs. Langley was a striking woman in her late 50s, with silver hair swept into an elegant chignon and a manner that was both aloof and commanding. She had lived in St. Mary Mead for decades, her grand house on the edge of the village a testament to her late husband's wealth. A young widow, Hawthorne, had courted her briefly, only to jilt her for a wealthier match in London. The slight had stung, and Mrs. Langley's cool demeanor at the dinner party had not gone unnoticed by Miss Marple. She remembered a woman in the village, a Miss Carter, who had nursed a grudge for years over a similar betrayal, her bitterness simmering until it erupted in unexpected ways. Tom Hawthorne, the victim's nephew, was next on Miss Marple's mental list. A lanky young man in his late 20s, with a shock of dark hair and an ambitious glint in his eye. Tom stood to inherit his uncle's considerable estate. Business matters, but Miss Marple suspected he was more interested in the promise of wealth. Craddock had learned that Tom's finances were precarious. He had a penchant for gambling and had racked up debts in London. The prospect of inheriting the manor, its lands, and Hawthorne's fortune would be a powerful motive. Miss Marple thought of a young man from her youth, a nephew much like Tom. She had seen such charm used to conceal darker intentions. Miss Emily Ellis, the governess employed by Hawthorne to tutor his young ward, a distant cousin's child, was a quieter figure, shy and reserved, with mousy brown hair and a habit of looking at the floor when spoken to. She seemed an unlikely suspect. Yet Craddock had discovered that Miss Ellis lived in fear of dismissal. Hawthorne had been a demanding employer, and Miss Ellis's position was precarious. Without her job, she faced destitution, as she had no family to fall back on. Miss Marple recalled a governess from St. Mary Mead's past, a Miss Turner, who had been so desperate to keep her position that she had resorted to deceit. Miss Ellis's quiet demeanor, Miss Marple thought, might hide a similar desperation, a willingness to act if pushed too far. Finally, there was Mr. Percy Vance. Vance was a tall, wiry man with a wild mane of gray hair and a penchant for dramatic gestures. He had clashed with Hawthorne over a land deal. Hawthorne had purchased a plot of land Vance had hoped to acquire for a studio, outbidding him with ease. The loss had left Vance bitter, and his outspoken criticism of Hawthorne had been the talk of the village, whose pride had led him to rash actions when his ambitions were thwarted. Vance's flamboyant manner, she thought, might conceal a deeper resentment, one strong enough to drive him to murder. As Miss Marple knitted, her mind wove these threads together, each guessed a piece of the puzzle. The manor's dining room, where the fatal glass of wine had been served, was a stage, and the guests were actors playing their parts. But who had slipped the cyanide into the glass? Who had the opportunity, the nerve, and the motive to commit such a bold crime? She knew that motives were not enough. There must be evidence, however subtle, to point the way. She set her knitting aside and rose, smoothing her skirt. It was time for a walk through the village, where she could listen to the gossip and observe the players in this drama. She donned her coat and hat, a simple black affair with a single feather, and stepped out into the crisp air. The village green was bustling now, with children playing near the duck pond and women chatting outside the tea shop. Miss Marple made her way to Mrs. Bantry's house, knowing her old friend would have gathered the latest rumors. Mrs. Bantry, a cheerful woman with a penchant for gardening and gossip, welcomed Miss Marple with a warm smile. "Jane, you're just in time for tea. The whole village is talking about poor Mr. Hawthorne. Dreadful business, isn't it?" Miss Marple nodded, settling into a chintz-covered chair. "Dreadful indeed, Dolly. What are people saying?" Mrs. Bantry's eyes sparkled with the thrill of sharing news. "Oh, all sorts of things. Some say it was Tom, the nephew, greedy for the inheritance. Others think Mrs. Langley never forgave Hawthorne for jilting her. And then there's Dr. Simmons. Did you know he was in debt? Mr. Cleary says he saw Simmons looking positively haggard last week, as if the world were on his shoulders. And what of Miss Ellis? And Mr. Vance?" Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Miss Ellis is a mouse, isn't she? Called him a Philistine in the pub last night, if you can believe it. That manor's been nothing but trouble since Hawthorne arrived." Miss Marple listened, filing away each tidbit. Mrs. Bantry's gossip was a treasure trove, revealing not just what people said, but how they felt. The village's collective judgment was harsh on Tom, suspicious of Mrs. Langley and wary of Simmons. Scandals to believe that the obvious answer was the right one. As she walked home at the manor, "I was there that night, you know, for a brief visit before the dinner. Such a shock." Miss Marple tilted her head, her eyes keen. "Nothing specific, I'm afraid, but the atmosphere was tense. Mr. Hawthorne was in high spirits, but the others seemed on edge. Dr. Simmons was particularly quiet, and Mrs. Langley barely spoke over his words. A tense atmosphere, she thought, was like a storm brewing small signs. The key, she knew, lay in the details, the glances, the silences. His charm made him a master of deception. Mrs. Langley's bitterness was palpable, yet her composure suggested control, not impulsiveness. Tom's ambition was clear, but his youth made him reckless, perhaps too reckless to plan such a careful crime. Miss Ellis's fear was genuine, but did she have the nerve to kill? And Vance, with his fiery temper, might have acted in a moment of rage, but would he be so precise? Miss Marple's needles clicked faster as she considered the wine glass itself. It knew what they were doing, or had access to someone who did. Cyanide, he had said, was not easily obtained, but a doctor like Simmons would have access. Institute, where the talk inevitably turned to the murder. Mrs. Price. Mrs. Cleary, the butcher's wife, disagreed, pointing to Mrs. Langley. "She's got a cold heart, that one. Never forgave Hawthorne for what he did to her." Miss Marple listened, her face a mask of polite interest, but her mind catalogued every opinion, every hint of bias. By evening, she had a clearer picture of the web of motives. As she prepared for bed, she thought of the missing wine glass, the one detail that nagged at her. Why had it been replaced? To hide fingerprints, perhaps, or to conceal something else entirely. She recalled a case from her youth, where a stolen letter had been the key to unraveling a crime. The glass, she decided, was the letter in this puzzle. Miss Marple climbed into bed, her mind still active. She knew the inspectors were frustrated, their methods focused on evidence and alibis. But she saw the case differently, through the lens of human nature. As she drifted off to sleep, she felt certain that the answer lay not in the manor's grand dining room, rose early, her resolve firm. She would visit the manor, ostensibly to offer condolences, but in truth to observe the guests again. As she walked up the hill to the manor, she passed the village pond, where a group of children were playing. One of them, young Tommy Price, waved to her. "Miss Marple, are you going to catch the murderer?" he called, his eyes wide with excitement. She smiled gently. Mr. Hawthorne was a difficult man, but to die like that, and now the police are everywhere asking questions. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. It must be very upsetting. "Were you in the dining room that night, Mrs. Gibbs?" The housekeeper shook her head. "No, miss. I was in the kitchen helping cook, but I saw the guests when they arrived." Young Mr. Tom was all smiles, but Miss Ellis looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. "His pockets," he greeted her with a forced smile. "Miss Marple, kind of you to come. It's a grim time, isn't it? You must be under a great deal of strain, Mr. Hawthorne." Voice was gentle. "People often look for the simplest explanation, but the truth is rarely simple, is it?" Tom's jaw tightened, and he said no more. Mrs. Langley entered next, her posture as regal as ever. "Miss Marple," she said coolly, "I didn't expect to see you here." Reginald Hawthorne was not a man who inspired affection. Miss Marple noted the bitterness in her tone, but also the control. Mrs. Langley was not one to act rashly. "Miss Marple, a pleasure, even in these circumstances. How is St. Mary Mead holding up under all this excitement?" "The village is resilient," she said, watching him closely. "But people do talk. They say you were a great friend to Mr. Hawthorne." Simmons's smile faltered. "A friend, yes." Miss Ellis appeared next, her hands twisting nervously. "Miss Marple," she murmured, "it's kind of you to come." "You poor dear," Miss Marple said kindly. "This must be so difficult for you." Miss Ellis's eyes filled with tears. Mr. Vance was the last to arrive, his hair wilder than ever. "But they can point to the truth, don't you think?" Vance snorted. "Truth in this village. It's all petty grudges and small minds." Miss Marple smiled, undeterred. She spent the next hour in the manor, moving from room to room, her presence barely noticed by the bustling inspectors. She observed the dining room, where the fatal dinner had taken place. The decanter, now empty, stood on a sideboard, its crystal catching the light. She pictured the scene, the guests chatting, the wine poured, the moment when the poison was slipped into the glass. It was a bold act, done under the noses of a dozen people. Whoever had done it was either very confident or very desperate. She smiled faintly. "Only that people are rarely what they seem, Inspector. Keep watching their eyes." Craddock chuckled, but Langley's expression was skeptical. "We'll stick to fingerprints and alibis, Miss Marple, but thank you." She nodded and made her way back to the village, her mind buzzing. The web of motives was intricate, but she was beginning to see a pattern. The key, she thought, was not just who had a reason to kill Hawthorne, but who had the means and the opportunity to do so undetected. The missing glass was a clue, but there was something else, something she had yet to grasp. As she reached her cottage, she saw young Tommy Price again, this time carrying a basket of apples from his mother's tree. "Miss Marple," he said, eagerly, "did you find the murderer?" "Not yet, Tommy," she said, patting his head, "but I'm getting closer." Inside, she sat by her fire, her knitting in her lap. The motives were clear, but the truth was still hidden. She thought of the village, its familiar faces and hidden secrets. Somewhere, among the gossip and the glances, was the answer. She would find it, she knew, not with fingerprints or alibis, but with the quiet observation of human nature, the kind that only an old spinster from St. Mary Mead could master. Chapter 5. The clue in the conversation. The sun hung low over St. Mary Mead, casting a golden glow across the village's thatched roofs and tidy gardens. The air was thick with the scent of blooming roses and freshly cut grass, but beneath this serene surface, the village buzzed with whispers. The death of Mr. Reginald Hawthorne had stirred the quiet community into a frenzy of speculation. Every tea shop, every garden gate, every chance meeting at the village post office was alight with theories about the poisoned wine and the mysterious circumstances of the Manor Library murder. In the midst of this, Miss Jane Marple sat quietly in her drawing room, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of the village's chatter. Miss Marple's cottage, a modest affair with its neat lace curtains and polished oak furniture, was a hub of subtle observation. She had always found that the best way to understand a mystery was to listen to the words people chose, the pauses they took, the glances they exchanged when they thought no one was watching. This afternoon she had invited a small group of village ladies for tea, not out of idle socializing, but with a purpose. She knew that in St. Mary Mead, gossip was not merely idle talk. It was a tapestry of truths and half-truths, woven together by those who knew the village's history better than any official record. The tea table was set with her best bone china, the cups adorned with delicate pink roses that matched the blooms. In her garden, Mrs. Price, the vicar's wife, sat primly with her hands folded, her eyes darting about as if expecting scandal to leap from the teapot. Miss Hartnell, a stout woman with a penchant for dramatic pronouncements, was already recounting the latest rumors about the dinner party guests. Mrs. Weatherby, a quieter soul but no less observant, sipped her tea and nodded thoughtfully, her mind clearly turning over some private speculation. And then there was young Lucy Islesborough, who had recently taken up a post as a domestic help in the village, but whose sharp wit and modern ways had caught Miss Marple's attention. Such a dreadful business, Miss Hartnell was saying, her voice carrying the weight of someone delivering a sermon. Poison, of all things. It's positively Gothic, isn't it? I mean, who would have thought St. Mary Mead would see such a thing? It reminds me of that awful business with poor Mrs. Symington years ago, though of course that was quite different. Miss Marple's needles paused for a fraction of a second, though her expression remained placid. Mrs. Symington, she asked gently, her tone inviting further explanation without pressing too hard. She had learned long ago that the best way to coax a story out of someone was to seem only mildly interested. "Oh, yes," Miss Hartnell said, leaning forward, her eyes gleaming with the thrill of imparting knowledge. "You remember, don't you, Jane? It was before your time here, Mrs. Weatherby, but it caused quite a stir. Mrs. Symington, poor soul, was found dead in her drawing room, and they said it was poison arsenic, I believe. The inquest ruled it accidental, but there were whispers, whispers that it wasn't an accident at all." Mrs. Price's lips pursed, and she set her teacup down with a faint clink. "Whispers are dangerous things, Miss Hartnell. One mustn't repeat such stories without evidence." "Oh, I'm not repeating anything improper," Miss Hartnell said quickly, though her tone suggested she relished the impropriety. "I'm only saying what everyone was saying at the time. There was talk of a grudge, you see. Mrs. Symington had been involved in a dispute over some land with a neighbor, and then there was that business with her husband's cousin, who stood to inherit a tidy sum if she were out of the picture. Nothing was ever proven, of course, but it does make one think. Miss Marple's needles resumed their steady rhythm, but her mind was racing. A poisoning case from years ago, here in St. Mary Mead, with whispers of hidden grudges and inheritance. Disputes it was too close to the current affair to be mere coincidence. She had always believed that human nature repeated itself, that the patterns of greed, jealousy, and betrayal were as predictable as the seasons. This old case, buried in the village's collective memory, might hold the key to understanding Mr. Hawthorne's death. And what became of the cousin? Miss Marple asked, her voice soft but deliberate, as if the question were an afterthought. Miss Hartnell shrugged, reaching for a scone. Oh, he left the village not long after. Went to London, I think, or perhaps abroad. People said he couldn't bear the gossip, innocent or not. But you know how it is once the whispers start, they stick. Lucy Islesborough, who had been quietly listening, spoke up for the first time. It's funny, isn't it, how people always assume the worst. I mean, poison is such a specific thing. It's not like someone just stumbles into it. Whoever did this to Mr. Hawthorne must have planned it carefully, don't you think? Miss Marple's eyes flickered toward Lucy, a spark of approval in their depths. The young woman had a knack for cutting through the fluff to the heart of a matter, a quality Miss Marple admired. Quite right, my dear, she said. Poisoning requires intent, and intent requires motive. It's not a crime of passion, but of calculation. Mrs. Weatherby nodded slowly. Calculation, she repeated, almost to herself. That's what makes it so chilling. To sit at a dinner table, smiling and chatting, all the while knowing you've slipped something deadly into someone's glass. It's monstrous. The conversation drifted to other topics. Mrs. Price's plans for the church bazaar, Miss Hartnell's complaints about the new postman, but Miss Marple's mind remained fixed on the old poisoning case. She excused herself briefly to fetch more hot water for the teapot, but in truth, she wanted a moment to think. In the kitchen, she stood by the window, gazing out at her garden, where the roses swayed gently in the breeze. The Symington case, she recalled, had indeed caused a stir, though she had been away visiting a niece at the time and had only heard the details second-hand. The official verdict of accidental poisoning had satisfied the authorities, but the village had never quite believed it. There had been talk of a jilted lover, a disputed will, even a family secret involving a hidden marriage. The details were hazy, but one thing stood out. The poison had been administered in a way that left no immediate suspect, much like Mr. Hawthorne's case. Returning to the drawing room, Miss Marple steered the conversation back to the present. It's curious, isn't it, she said, pouring tea with a steady hand, how similar this business with Mr. Hawthorne feels to that old story. A poison in a glass, a room full of people, and no one quite sure who could have done it. One wonders if there's a connection. Miss Hartnell's eyes widened. A connection? Oh, Jane, you don't think? Surely not. That was ages ago. Time doesn't erase human nature, Miss Marple said mildly. People do the same things over and over, only in different ways. I dare say, if we looked into the old case, we might find something useful. Mrs. Price looked skeptical. But what could an old scandal have to do with Mr. Hawthorne? He was new to the village, wasn't he? Hardly here long enough to stir up old grudges. Perhaps, Miss Marple said, her tone non-committal. But newcomers have a way of bringing old secrets to light, don't they? They come with their own histories, and sometimes those histories collide with ours. Lucy leaned forward, her curiosity piqued. Do you think someone at that dinner party knew about the old case? Maybe they got the idea from it, like a sort of inspiration. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Inspiration is a good word, Lucy. Criminals often draw on what they know, what they've heard. A story from the past might plant a seed, especially if it went unpunished. The tea party continued, but Miss Marple's thoughts were elsewhere. She made a mental note to visit the vicarage later and ask to see the parish records, which often held clues to old village scandals. She also resolved to speak with old Mr. Clemens, the village's unofficial historian, who remembered every scandal, every feud, every whispered rumor from the past 50 years. If there was a connection between the Symington case and Mr. Hawthorne's murder, she would find it. As the ladies left, Miss Marple sat back in her armchair, her knitting resting in her lap. The village was quiet now, the golden light of evening giving way to the soft purple of dusk. But beneath the calm, she sensed a current of unease, a shadow cast by secrets long buried. She thought of the dinner party guest, Simmons with his charming smile, Mrs. Langley with her guarded eyes, Tom Hawthorne with his nervous energy, Miss Ellis with her quiet fears, and Mr. Vance with his erratic ways. Each had a motive, each had access to the wine, and each, she suspected, was hiding something. The clue from the tea party conversation had sparked her curiosity, but it was only the beginning. She needed to know more about the Symington case, its players, its motives, its outcome. Had someone at the dinner party known of it? Had they seen in it a blueprint for murder, a way to rid themselves of Mr. Hawthorne without leaving a trace? Or was there a deeper connection, a thread that tied the past to the present? Miss Marple rose and moved to her writing desk, where she kept a small notebook for such occasions. She jotted down the names of the guests, their motives as Inspector Craddock had outlined them, and a single word, Symington. Then she added a question mark, followed by another word, grudge. She closed the notebook and placed it back in the drawer, her mind already turning to the next step. The village clock chimed 6, its familiar toll echoing across St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple glanced out the window, where the last rays of sunlight illuminated the church spire. She had always believed that the truth lay in the small things, overheard remark, the fleeting glance, the forgotten scandal, and in St. Mary Mead, where everyone knew everyone else's business. She began with a visit to the vicarage, where Mrs. Price, ever eager to be helpful, allowed her access to the parish records. Miss Marple spent hours poring over them, noting births, marriages, and deaths. Note about the inquest's verdict of accidental poisoning. There was no mention of a cousin or a land dispute, but there was a reference to a local doctor who had testified at the inquest, Dr. Griffith, of poisons, perhaps even access to them. She made a note to ask Mr. Clemens about Dr. Griffith and whether he had, which coincided with a time when several of the dinner party guests were either living in or visiting the village. Dr. Simmons, for instance, had arrived in St. Mary Mead around that time, taking over the practice of the retiring Dr. Griffith. Could he have heard of the Symington case? Could he have learned something from it? something that inspired his own actions. Her next stop was Mr. Clemens, who lived in a small cottage at the edge of the village, surrounded by a garden that was more weeds than flowers. He was a wiry man in his 80s, with a sharp memory and a love for storytelling. When Miss Marple mentioned the Symington case, his eyes lit up. Double quotes. "Oh, that was a proper scandal," he said, leaning back in his creaking chair. "Nobody believed that accidental nonsense. You know, Mrs. Symington was a proud woman. There was talk of her husband's cousin, a shifty sort who'd been seen lurking about the house. And then there was that neighbor, Mr. Pye, who'd been after her land for years. He was a queer one, always stirring up trouble." Miss Marple listened intently, her mind cataloging every detail. Mr. Pye, she recalled, had long since passed away, but his name struck a chord. She had heard it mentioned in connection with another villager, Mrs. Langley, perhaps, or was it Mr. Vance? She would need to check her notes. Did anyone else stand out in that case? She asked. Anyone who might still be in the village? Mr. Clemens scratched his chin. Well, there was Dr. Griffith, of course. He was the one who said it was an accident, though I always thought he was covering for someone. And there was a young governess, I forget her name, who worked for the Symingtons. She left soon after, said the gossip was too much for her. A governess, Miss Marple thought, her heart quickening. Could it be Miss Ellis, or perhaps someone related to her? The parallels were growing stronger, and she felt the familiar thrill of piecing together a puzzle. "Thank you, Mr. Clemens," she said, rising to leave. "You've been most helpful." Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her notebook open before her. She added the new information: Dr. Griffith, the cousin; Mr. Pye, the governess. Cast over the present, its details murky but suggestive. She needed to know more about Dr. Simmons's early days in the village, and whether Miss Ellis had any connection to the Symingtons or their circle. The next morning, she took a walk to the village shop, where gossip flowed as freely as the tea at her cottage. Mrs. Baker, the shopkeeper, was a font of information. When Miss Marple casually mentioned Dr. Simmons, Mrs. Baker launched into a tale of his arrival in St. Mary Mead. He was a young man then, took over from Dr. Griffith, you know, and everyone said he was a breath of fresh air. But there was talk he'd had some trouble in his last post, something about money, I think. Nothing proven, mind you. Miss Marple nodded, her face a mask of polite interest. Money troubles, she thought. Could his desperation have led him to study the Symington case, to see in it a way to eliminate his creditor without suspicion? As for Miss Ellis, Mrs. Baker had less to say. She's a quiet one, that governess. Came to the village a few years back, keeps to herself. I heard she worked for a family up north before, but she doesn't talk about it. Miss Marple thanked Mrs. Baker and left the shop, her mind turning over the new pieces of the puzzle. The Symington case was no longer just a curiosity. She decided to pay a visit to Miss Ellis, to see if she could coax out any connection to the past. Miss Ellis lived in a small, rented room above the village bakery. She welcomed Miss Marple with a nervous smile, her hands twisting in her lap as they sat down to tea. But she was watching, always watching, for the flicker of unease. It must be difficult, with all this talk about poor Mr. Hawthorne. Miss Ellis nodded, her eyes fixed on her teacup. It's dreadful, she said softly. Tragedies, Miss Marple said, her voice almost a murmur. There was a case years ago, with a Mrs. Symington. Poison, they said, though it was ruled an accident. Miss Ellis's hands stilled, and for a moment her face was unreadable. Then she shook her head. No, I don't think so. I mean, I've heard people mention it, but I don't know the details. Miss Marple smiled, but her eyes were sharp. Miss Ellis was hiding something, though whether it was guilt or merely discomfort, Miss Marple could not yet say. She changed the subject, talking of the church choir and the upcoming fete, but her mind was elsewhere. Miss Ellis's reaction had confirmed her suspicion. The Symington case was not just a village legend. It was a living memory, one that touched the present in ways she had yet to uncover. That evening, the Symington case, with its poison and its unanswered questions, was a thread that ran through the current mystery. Dr. Simmons, with his money troubles and his connection to Dr. Griffith. Miss Ellis, with her secretive past. Even Mrs. Langley, whose bitterness toward Mr. Hawthorne might echo an older grudge, were pieces of the puzzle. And then there was the missing wineglass, the swapped decanter, the calculated nature of the crime. Whoever had killed Mr. Hawthorne had planned it carefully, perhaps inspired by a scandal they thought long forgotten. Miss Marple closed her eyes, letting the pieces settle in her mind. She thought of the village, with its quiet lanes and hidden secrets, its people who carried their histories like shadows. She thought of the dinner party, the guests moving around the table, the wine poured and sipped, the poison waiting silently. And she thought of the Symington case, a story of greed or revenge or desperation, its echoes reverberating through time. The truth, she knew, was close. It lay in the connections, the small details that others overlooked. Tomorrow, she would speak to Inspector Craddock, share her thoughts about the Symington case. She would also keep an eye on Miss Ellis, whose quiet demeanor hid a story yet to be told. And she would listen, always listen, to the village's whispers, for in them lay the key to unraveling the mystery. As the fire crackled and the clock ticked softly, Miss Marple felt a quiet satisfaction. The puzzle was complex, but she had faced such puzzles before, in St. Mary Mead, where human nature was laid bare in every glance and word. Chapter 6. The Missing Glass. The morning after the dinner party. St. Mary Mead was abuzz with a fervor that hadn't been felt since the scandalous affair of the vicar's missing bicycle 2 summers ago. The village, usually content with the gentle rhythm of daily life, tea at the vicarage, gossip at the post office, and the occasional squabble over garden boundaries, had been thrust into a whirlwind of speculation and intrigue. The death of Mr. Reginald Hawthorne, the wealthy newcomer who had taken up residence at the Grand Hawthorne Manor only 6 months prior, was no ordinary tragedy. It was murder. And the method, poison in a glass of wine, had left the village both horrified and fascinated. Inspector Craddock, a man of steady demeanor but growing frustration, stood in the manor's dining room, his notebook open and his brow furrowed. Beside him, Chief Inspector Langley, a detective of some renown from Scotland Yard, paced slowly, his sharp eyes scanning the room, as if expecting the walls themselves to whisper a confession. The dining room, with its heavy oak table, polished silver candelabras, and crystal chandelier, seemed an unlikely stage for such a sinister act. Yet it was here, amidst the clink of glasses and the murmur of polite conversation, that Hawthorne had taken his final sip. The inspectors had spent the morning interviewing the servants, who were a mix of loyal retainers and new hires brought by Hawthorne from London. The butler, Mr. Jenkins, a man with a face as lined as an old map, swore he had served the wine himself, pouring from a decanter that sat prominently on the sideboard. The maids, flustered and teary, could offer little beyond assurances that they had been busy in the kitchen or tidying the drawing-room. The cook, a stout woman named Mrs. Baxter, insisted the wine had been untouched in the cellar until that evening, and she had no reason to doubt its purity. But the most perplexing discovery came just before noon, when Inspector Craddock, in a moment of fastidiousness, requested to examine the glass from which Hawthorne had drunk. The servants led him to the sideboard, where the used glasses from the dinner party had been collected for washing. To everyone's astonishment, the glass in question, the one that had held the poisoned wine, was not among them. In its place was a clean, polished glass, identical in design, but devoid of any trace of wine, poison, or fingerprints. "It's gone," Craddock said, his voice tight with disbelief. He held up the clean glass, turning it in the light as if it might reveal some hidden truth. Someone replaced it deliberately. Chief Inspector Langley, whose reputation for solving complex cases had preceded him, crossed his arms and frowned. "This complicates things," he said, stating the obvious with a gravitas that made the servants exchange nervous glances. "The killer must have swapped the glass to destroy evidence. Fingerprints, residue, anything that could point to them." The servants were dismissed, and the inspectors began a meticulous search of the dining room, hoping to find the missing glass. Tucked behind a curtain or hidden in a drawer, they found nothing. The room, though grand, was not so large as to offer many hiding places, and the idea of the glass being spirited away entirely seemed both implausible and infuriating. It was then that Miss Jane Marple, who had been invited to the manor by Inspector Craddock not as a suspect, but as a local whose keen observation had aided him in past cases, centered the dining room. She moved with the unhurried grace of an elderly spinster, her gray hair neatly pinned beneath a modest hat, her eyes bright and alert behind her spectacles. She carried a small knitting bag, from which a ball of pale blue wool peeked out, and her expression was one of polite curiosity, though those who knew her well would have recognized the sharpness beneath it. "Good morning, Inspector Craddock." "Chief Inspector Langley," she said, her voice soft but clear. "I heard about the missing glass. Quite a puzzle, isn't it?" Craddock, who had grown accustomed to Miss Marple's knack for appearing at just the right moment, gave her a weary smile. "A puzzle indeed, Miss Marple. The glass is gone, and with it any chance of finding traces of the poison or the person who handled it. We're at a loss." Miss Marple tilted her head, her eyes drifting over the dining room. The table was still set, though the plates had been cleared. The decanter, half full of deep red wine, sat on the sideboard, its crystal facets catching the morning light. The chairs, pushed back slightly, hinted at the haste with which the guests had left after Hawthorne's collapse. She stepped closer to the sideboard, her fingers brushing lightly against the polished wood. "It's curious, isn't it," she said, almost to herself, "that someone would go to the trouble of replacing the glass. It suggests a certain presence of mind, don't you think, to act so quickly in a room full of people without being noticed?" Langley, who was less familiar with Miss Marple's methods, raised an eyebrow. Presence of mind, perhaps, but also opportunity. Whoever did this had to have access to the dining room after the murder, and they had to know where to find a clean glass. Quite so, Miss Marple agreed, her tone mild. And who would have such access? The servants, of course, but they were all accounted for, in the kitchen or elsewhere. The guests, then they were all here, at the table, with the decanter, in plain view. Craddock flipped through his notebook, his pencil tapping against the page. The guests, he said, reading from his notes. Dr. Simmons, Mrs. Langley, Tom Hawthorne, Miss Ellis, and Mr. Vance. All of them had the opportunity to tamper with the wine before it was served, but swapping the glass afterward, that's trickier. The room was never empty after Hawthorne collapsed. The servants were in and out, and the guests stayed until we arrived. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes narrowing slightly as she considered the scene. And yet, she said, the glass was swapped, which means someone was clever enough to do it under everyone's noses. Or perhaps, she paused, her fingers tightening around the handle of her knitting bag. Perhaps it was done before the collapse was noticed, during the chaos, when everyone was distracted by Mr. Hawthorne's distress. Langley stopped pacing, his interest piqued. Before? You mean the killer swapped the glass while Hawthorne was still alive? It's possible, Miss Marple said. People are often distracted when something shocking happens. A man clutching his throat, gasping for air, would draw every eye in the room. A quick hand, a moment's diversion, and the glass could be replaced with one from the sideboard. Craddock rubbed his chin, his mind racing. But why? Why not just leave the glass and let it be tested? The poison would be traced to the wine, not necessarily to the killer. Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile. Fingerprints, Inspector. The glass would have the killer's fingerprints, wouldn't it? If they handled it to add the poison, their prints would be there, along with Mr. Hawthorne's. By replacing it with a clean glass, they ensured no evidence could point directly to them. Langley nodded slowly, impressed despite himself. Clever, he said, but it narrows our suspects. Whoever did this had to be close enough to the table to make the switch, and they had to know the glass would be examined. Which brings us back to the guests, Craddock said, his voice heavy with the weight of the investigation. Tom Hawthorne, the nephew, was pouring wine for everyone. He'd have had the easiest access. Dr. Simmons was seated next to Hawthorne, close enough to slip something into his glass. Mrs. Langley was across the table, but she could have moved quickly. Miss Ellis and Mr. Vance were farther away, but not impossibly so. Miss Marple listened quietly, her eyes drifting to the decanter. She stepped closer, peering at the crystal as if it held some secret. The decanter, she said softly. It's still here, isn't it? Has it been tested? Craddock nodded. We sent a sample to the lab this morning. If the poison was in the decanter, it would have affected everyone who drank from it. But only Hawthorne was poisoned, which means the poison was likely added to his glass alone. Or, Miss Marple said, her voice thoughtful. The poison was in the decanter, but only his glass was filled with the tainted wine. A clever killer might have poured from the top, where the poison settled, or used a sleight of hand to ensure only his glass was affected. Langley's eyes narrowed. That's a stretch, Miss Marple. The servants said the decanter was filled just before dinner, and Jenkins poured the wine himself. Are you suggesting he's involved? Oh no, Miss Marple said quickly, her tone apologetic. "Mr. Jenkins strikes me as a most reliable man. I was only thinking of possibilities. In my experience, people can be very clever when they wish to avoid being caught. I once knew a young man in St. Mary Mead grocer's assistant who managed to slip a shilling from the till every day without anyone noticing. He was so quick, you see, and so ordinary in his manner that no one suspected him until the accounts didn't add up." Craddock, who had heard many of Miss Marple's village anecdotes, suppressed a smile. "So you think our killer is someone quick and ordinary? That doesn't narrow it down much." "Perhaps not," Miss Marple admitted, "but it does suggest someone who knows how to blend in. Someone who could move through the room without drawing attention. Tell me, Inspector, what did the guests do after Mr. Hawthorne collapsed?" Craddock consulted his notes. "According to the servants, it was chaos. Hawthorne stood up, clutched his throat, and fell forward onto the table. The guests were shocked. Some stood, some called for help. Dr. Simmons tried to assist him, checking his pulse and loosening his collar. Mrs. Langley screamed and backed away. Tom Hawthorne ran to fetch water from the sideboard. Miss Ellis fainted, and Mr. Vance caught her before she hit the floor. The servants rushed in, and someone sent for the police." Miss Marple nodded, her mind working through the scene. "A busy moment," she said. "So many people moving, shouting, acting on instinct. It would be the perfect time to swap a glass, wouldn't it? Especially if the killer was already near the sideboard." Craddock's eyes lit up. "Tom Hawthorne," he said. "He was at the sideboard, getting water. He could have grabbed a clean glass and swapped it with the poisoned one." "Possibly," Miss Marple said, her tone cautious. "But we mustn't jump to conclusions. Tom is a young man, and young men can be impulsive, but they're not always clever. This act required planning. The killer had to know the glass would be examined, and they had to have a clean one ready. That suggests forethought, not impulse." Langley, who had been listening intently, spoke up. "What about Dr. Simmons? He was right next to Hawthorne, trying to help. He could have palmed the glass and replaced it while everyone was distracted." Miss Marple tilted her head, considering. "Dr. Simmons is a clever man," she said. "I've seen him at the village fete, charming everyone with his stories. He has a way of making you trust him, but I wonder. A doctor would know about poisons, wouldn't he? And he'd know how to administer them without being seen." Craddock scribbled a note. "We'll check his background, if he's got access. 2 poisons, that's a start, but we can't rule out the others." Mrs. Langley could have acted in the chaos, and Miss Ellis, despite fainting, might have been closer to the table than we think. "Mr. Vance, too, he's an odd one." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Odd, yes, but not necessarily guilty. I knew an artist once, in St. Mary Mead, who was terribly eccentric, painted his house bright purple, and kept a pet parrot that swore in French. But he was harmless, Mr. Vance. Reminds me of him, though I don't think he's quite so innocent." The inspectors exchanged a glance, unsure whether to take Miss Marple's village comparisons seriously. But Craddock, who had learned to trust her instincts, pressed on. "What do you suggest, Miss Marple? We've got no glass, no clear evidence, and 5 suspects with motives. Where do we go from here?" Miss Marple adjusted her shawl, her eyes drifting back to the decanter. "I think," she said slowly, "we should look at the sideboard more closely. The clean glass came from somewhere, didn't it? And if it was taken from the sideboard, There might be something, a smudge, a mark, a trace of something that could tell us who handled it. Langley nodded, impressed by her practicality. Good idea. We'll dust the sideboard and the remaining glasses for fingerprints. If we find anything, it might point us to the killer. And, Miss Marple added, her voice soft but firm, I think we should talk to the guests again, not as suspects, but as witnesses. Ask them what they saw, what they heard, what they did in those moments after Mr. Hawthorne collapsed. People often reveal more than they mean to when they're asked to describe a scene. Craddock closed his notebook, a spark of determination in his eyes. Right? We'll start with the sideboard, and then bring the guests back for another round of questions. Miss Marple, will you join us? Your perspective might be useful. Miss Marple inclined her head, her expression demure. I'd be happy to help, Inspector. It's such a curious case, isn't it? It reminds me of a little incident in St. Mary Mead years ago when a teacup went missing from the vicarage. It turned up in the most unexpected place, and it told us everything we needed to know. Langley raised an eyebrow, but Craddock only smiled. Let's hope this glass turns up too, he said, and that it tells us who killed Reginald Hawthorne. As the inspectors set to work, Miss Marple lingered in the dining room, her eyes scanning the table, the chairs, the sideboard. She thought of the guest stum with his nervous energy, Dr. Simmons with his practiced charm, Mrs. Langley with her quiet bitterness, Miss Ellis with her shy demeanor, and Mr. Vance with his erratic flair. One of them, she was certain, had swapped the glass. One of them had poisoned Reginald Hawthorne, and one of them, she suspected, was not nearly as clever as they thought. The village of St. Mary Mead, with its quaint cottages and gossip-filled lanes, had seen its share of secrets. Miss Marple knew that beneath the surface of every polite smile, every casual remark, there lay a truth waiting to be uncovered. And as she left the manor, her knitting bag swinging gently at her side, she felt a familiar, stirring sense that the missing glass, like the missing teacup all those years ago, would lead her to the heart of the mystery. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the manor's lawn as Miss Marple made her way back to her cottage. She passed the post office, where Mrs. Price, the postmistress, was already spreading the news of the missing glass to a cluster of eager listeners. She passed the vicarage, where the vicar's wife waved cheerfully, unaware of the dark thoughts occupying Miss Marple's mind. And she passed the village green, where children played and laughed, oblivious to the shadow of murder that had fallen over St. Mary Mead. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple settled into her armchair by the window, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on a pale blue scarf. Her mind, however, was not on the wool, but on the dining room, the decanter, the missing glass. She thought of the guests, their motives, their movements. She thought of the chaos after Hawthorne's collapse, the flurry of activity that had masked a killer's quick hand. And she thought of a story she'd once heard about a maid in a neighboring village who had swapped a poisoned teacup for a clean one to protect her lover. The maid had been clever, but not clever enough. She had forgotten one small detailer, tiny chip on the cup's rim that had given her away. Miss Marple's needles paused. A chip, a mark, a detail. She smiled to herself, her eyes bright with the thrill of the puzzle. The missing glass was the key. She was sure of it. And somewhere, in the manor, in the guests' stories, in the village itself, there was a detail that would unlock the truth. the investigation continued, with Inspector Craddock and Chief Inspector Langley combing the dining room for clues. They dusted the sideboard, the decanter, the remaining glasses, finding only the expected fingerprints of the butler and the maids. They interviewed the guests again, asking for precise accounts of their actions after Hawthorne's collapse. Tom Hawthorne insisted he had only fetched water, his hands shaking as he spoke. Dr. Simmons described his attempts to revive Hawthorne, his voice steady but his eyes flickering with unease. Mrs. Langley recounted her shock, her words clipped and precise. Miss Ellis, still pale from the ordeal, stammered through her account of fainting, and Mr. Vance, with a theatrical flourish, described catching Miss Ellis and calling for help, his story peppered with unnecessary details about the moonlight. Outside, Miss Marple listened to each account, her knitting needles moving steadily as she sat in the corner of the Manor's drawing room where the interviews took place. She said little, but her mind was a whirl of connections, comparisons, memories. She thought of the grocer's assistant, the painter with the purple house, the maid with the chipped teacup. She thought of the guests, their faces, their words, their lies. By evening, the inspectors were no closer to finding the missing glass, but Miss Marple was not discouraged. She returned to her cottage, brewed a pot of tea, and sat by the fire, her knitting in her lap. The puzzle was far from solved, but she felt a quiet certainty that the truth was within reach. The missing glass, like all missing things, would eventually be found, not in the Manor, perhaps, but in the stories, the glances, the silences of those who had been in that dining room as the village settled into the quiet of the night. Marple sipped her tea and let her mind wander. The killer had been clever, but cleverness, she knew, often led to mistakes. A swapped glass, a hidden motive, a moment of hesitations, something would betray them. And when it did, Miss Jane Marple would be there, with her knitting and her sharp eyes, ready to unravel the mystery of the missing glass. Chapter 7. Shadows of Doubt. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of St. Mary Mead's quaint village hall, casting delicate patterns on the polished wooden floor. The hall, usually reserved for tea parties and flower shows, had been commandeered by Inspector Craddock and Chief Inspector Langley for their investigation into Mr. Reginald Hawthorne's murder. The air was thick with tension, a stark contrast to the usual chatter of village gossip. Today, the room buzzed with a different kind of inner suspicion, doubt, and the weight of unanswered questions. Miss Jane Marple sat quietly in a corner, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically, a soft counterpoint to the low hum of voices. Her sharp eyes, hidden behind the pretense of a gentle old lady, darted from face to face, observing the subtle shifts in demeanor among the dinner party guests. The inspectors had summoned them, Dr. Simmons, Mrs. Langley, Tom Hawthorne, Miss Ellis, and Mr. Vanster, review the evidence, particularly the new discovery that sent ripples of unease through the group. Tom Hawthorne's fingerprints. On the decanter, Inspector Craddock stood at the front of the room, his broad shoulders squared, his face set in a determined frown. Beside him, Chief Inspector Langley, older and more weathered, leaned against a table, his arms crossed. The two men, though seasoned in their craft, were visibly frustrated. The case was slipping through their fingers like sand, and the pressure from Scotland Yard to deliver results was mounting. Mr. Hawthorne, Craddock began, addressing Tom, who stood near the window, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. Your fingerprints were found on the decanter from which the poisoned wine was poured. Can you explain that?" Tom, a lanky young man in his late 20s with a mop of dark hair and a perpetually anxious expression, shifted uncomfortably. His eyes flicked to the floor, then to the other guests, as if searching for an ally. "I told you, Inspector. I poured wine for everyone that night. Of course, my fingerprints are on the decanter. I was helping serve. Langley's voice was sharp, cutting through the room like a blade. "Or helping yourself to your uncle's fortune. You stand to inherit his entire estate, don't you?" The accusation hung in the air, heavy and accusing. Tom's face flushed red, and he took a step forward, his hands balling into fists. "That's absurd. I didn't kill him. I cared about my uncle. He was family." Miss Marple's needles paused for a fraction of a second, her gaze lingering on Tom. She noted the way his voice cracked, the slight tremor in his hands. He reminded her of young Tommy Pierce from St. Mary Mead, a boy who had once lied to protect his older brother from a theft charge. Tommy's nervousness had been much the same: eyes darting, voice unsteady, not out of guilt, but out of fear of being misunderstood. She tucked the observation away, her mind already weaving connections. Mrs. Langley, seated primly in a high-backed chair, raised an eyebrow. Her dark hair was pulled into a severe bun, and her lips were set in a thin line. "Really, Tom, there's no need to be so dramatic. We all know you were desperate for money. Reginald mentioned it often enough." Tom whirled on her, his eyes flashing. "And what about you, Mrs. Langley? Everyone in the village knows you hated my uncle after he humiliated you at that charity gala years ago. If anyone had a reason to want him gone, it's you." The room erupted into murmurs. Dr. Simmons, standing near the back, adjusted his glasses nervously, while Miss Ellis, the governess, shrank further into her chair, her pale face almost blending with her gray dress. Mr. Vance, the eccentric artist, let out a low chuckle, as if the entire scene amused him. "Enough," Craddock's voice boomed, silencing the room. "We're here to get answers, not to sling accusations. The fact remains that the poisoned wine came from that decanter, and, Tom, your fingerprints are the only ones we've found so far." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, her needles resuming their steady rhythm. "If I may, Inspector," she said, her voice soft but carrying an undeniable authority. All eyes turned to her, some with curiosity, others with barely concealed irritation. "Fingerprints on a decanter are hardly surprising, given that Tom says he handled it during the dinner. What interests me more is the glass itself. You said it was missing, replaced with a clean one. That suggests someone had the opportunity to swap it after the poison was administered. Someone quick, someone who knew the layout of the dining room." "Well," Craddock frowned, considering her words. "You're suggesting the killer acted in the moment, Miss Marple, perhaps?" she replied, her tone mild. "Or perhaps they planned it carefully. In my experience, people in villages like St. Mary Mead are often very good at covering their tracks. They know how to blend in, to avoid drawing attention." Langley snorted, though there was a grudging respect in his eyes. "With all due respect, Miss Marple, we're dealing with a murder, not a village squabble over stolen apples. The killer had to have access to the poison, the motive, and the opportunity." Miss Marple smiled faintly, unruffled. "Oh, I quite agree, Chief Inspector. But motives are often hidden in the smallest details. A glance, A word, a moment of hesitation. You'd be surprised what a village can teach you about human nature. The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling over the group. Tom shifted again, his eyes darting to Miss Ellis, who quickly looked away. Dr. Simmons cleared his throat, stepping forward. "If I may, inspectors, I think we're overlooking something. The poison cyanide, wasn't it? It's not exactly something you pick up at the local chemist. Whoever used it had to have access to it, and I'm a doctor, so naturally you'd suspect me. But I assure you, my supplies are strictly accounted for." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, though her expression remained serene. Dr. Simmons's quick defense reminded her of Dr. Haydock, a village physician who once tried to deflect suspicion in a case of missing laudanum by volunteering too much information. She made a mental note to inquire further about the doctor's financial troubles, which Craddock had mentioned earlier. Mrs. Langley stood, smoothing her skirt with a deliberate motion. "This is all very theatrical, but I fail to see why we're all being treated like criminals. I was nowhere near the dining room when Reginald was poisoned. I was in the drawing room, discussing art with Mr. Vance." Vance nodded, his paint-stained fingers drumming on the arm of his chair. "Indeed, Mrs. Langley has an eye for color, though her taste in landscapes is abysmal." His tone was light, but his eyes flicked toward Tom. Sharp and assessing, Miss Marple watched the exchange, her mind turning over the dynamics of the group. Mrs. Langley's composure was almost too perfect, like Mrs. Eldridge from St. Mary Mead, who had maintained an impeccable facade while harboring a grudge against her late husband. Mr. Vance's flippancy, on the other hand, felt calculated, as if he were hiding something behind his eccentric persona. Craddock turned to Miss Ellis, who had been silent throughout the discussion. "Miss Ellis, you were in the dining room most of the evening, weren't you? Did you notice anything unusual about the wine or the glasses?" The governess's hands twisted in her lap, her knuckles white. I don't know, Inspector. I was busy serving the children their meal in the next room. I only came in to check on Mr. Hawthorne once or twice. I didn't see anything strange." Her voice was barely above a whisper, and Miss Marple noted the way her eyes avoided Tom's. There was something there, she thought. She recalled a young governess from years ago, a girl named Clara, who had been terrified to speak up about a theft because she feared losing her position. Miss Ellis's demeanor was strikingly similar. The meeting dragged on, with Craddock and Langley questioning each guest in turn, but no new revelations emerged. The decanter, the missing glass, and Tom's fingerprints remained the only tangible clues, and they pointed in too many directions at once. As the group dispersed, Miss Marple lingered, her knitting tucked neatly into her bag. Outside, the village was alive with its usual rhythm children playing in the square. Mrs. Bantry gossiping with the postmistress, the clatter of teacups from the Blue Boar Inn. But beneath the surface, St. Mary Mead was unsettled, the shadow of murder casting a pall over its idyllic charm. Miss Marple walked slowly toward her cottage, her mind a whirl of observations. Tom's nervousness, Miss Ellis's reticence, Dr. Simmons's defensiveness, Mrs. Langley's composure, Mr. Vance's flippancy. Each piece of the puzzle was distinct, yet they fit together in a way she couldn't yet see. She thought of the missing glass, the clean one left in its place. It was a clever move, one that required both nerve and opportunity. The dining room at Hawthorne Manor was large, with multiple exits, but only someone familiar with its layout could have acted so swiftly. As she passed the vicarage, she spotted young Tommy Pierce, no relation to the boy from years ago, kicking a ball against the wall. He grinned at her, and she smiled back, her thoughts drifting to the parallels between this case and the scandals of St. Mary Mead's past. There was always a pattern, she mused, a thread that connected the seemingly unconnected. The trick was finding it. That evening, Miss Marple sat by her fireplace, a cup of tea cooling on the table beside her. Her knitting lay untouched as she turned the case over in her mind. Tom's fingerprints were troubling, but not conclusive. Anyone could have handled the decanter after the fact, and the missing glass suggested a deliberate attempt to obscure evidence. She considered the poison itself cyanide, fast-acting and deadly. Dr. Simmons had access, of course, but so might others. She recalled a case from years ago, when a gardener in St. Mary Mead had used cyanide to kill pests, only for it to end up in the wrong hands. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Inspector Craddock, his face weary but determined. "Miss Marple," he said, stepping inside, "I hope I'm not disturbing you. I wanted to get your thoughts on today's meeting. You seemed observant." Miss Marple gestured for him to sit, her smile warm but guarded. "You're never a disturbance, Inspector. I was just thinking about young Tom. He's in a difficult position, isn't he? The fingerprints, the inheritance, it all looks very damning." Craddock nodded, running a hand through his hair. "It does. But I can't shake the feeling he's not telling us everything. He's nervous, jumpy, like he's hiding something, or protecting someone," Miss Marple said softly. "In my experience, young men like Tom often act out of loyalty, not guilt. You remember Tommy Pierce, don't you? The boy who lied to save his brother. Tom Hawthorne has that same look about him." Craddock leaned forward, his interest piqued. "You think he's covering for someone who—" Miss Marple shook her head. "I don't know yet, Inspector, but I do know that people in villages like ours are rarely as simple as they seem. Take Dr. Simmons, for instance. He was quick to defend himself today, wasn't he? Almost too quick." Craddock frowned. "You think he's involved?" "I think," Miss Marple said carefully, "that people who owe money, as Dr. Simmons does, can be driven to desperate measures. And then there's Mrs. Langley, so composed, so controlled, but bitterness can fester, Inspector, like a wound, left untreated, and Mr. Vance's alibi is shaky at best. As for Miss Ellis," she trailed off, her eyes distant. Craddock waited, but Miss Marple only smiled. "You're holding something back," he said, half amused, half frustrated. "You always do. Just waiting for the pieces to fall into place. They always do, in time." Craddock left soon after, promising to keep her updated. As the door closed behind him, Miss Marple returned to her chair, her mind racing. The case was like one of her jigsaw puzzles, the kind she used to do with her nephew Raymond Scudder, pieces that seemed unrelated until you found the one that connected them all. The missing glass, the fingerprints, the motives, they were all part of the picture. But the key was still missing. The next morning, Miss Marple attended a tea gathering at Mrs. Bantry's, a perfect opportunity to observe the village's pulse. The room was filled with the usual faces: Mrs. Price, the postmistress, Miss Hartnell, always eager for gossip, and Mrs. Cleary, whose sharp tongue could cut through any pretense. The conversation inevitably turned to the murder, with theories. flying as freely as the scones. "I heard Tom Hawthorne's been arrested," Miss Hartnell said, her eyes gleaming. "Fingerprints on the decanter, they say. It's always the family, isn't it?" Mrs. Bantry, ever the skeptic, shook her head. "I don't believe it. Tom's a good boy, if a bit reckless. Besides, why would he risk everything when he was already set to inherit?" Miss Marple sipped her tea, listening intently. Mrs. Cleary leaned forward, lowering her voice. "If you ask me, it's that Dr. Simmons, always acting so charming, but I heard he's up to his ears in debt. And who better to get hold of poison than a doctor?" The mention of Dr. Simmons caught Miss Marple's attention. She recalled his nervous fidgeting at the meeting, the way he adjusted his glasses when questioned. It was a small thing, but small things often mattered most. She thought of Miss Ellis, too, her quiet demeanor and downcast eyes. There was something there, something unspoken, as the tea party continued. Miss Marple steered the conversation toward the dinner party, probing gently for details. Mrs. Price mentioned seeing Miss Ellis near the dining room that night, carrying a tray of glasses. "She looked ever so flustered," Mrs. Price said. "I thought she was just nervous about serving, but now I wonder." Miss Marple filed the information away, her mind returning to the missing glass. Whoever had swapped it had to have acted quickly in the chaos of the dinner. Miss Ellis, with her access to the dining room, was a possibility, but her motive was unclear. Love, perhaps, or fear. Miss Marple had seen both drive people to desperate acts. That afternoon, she visited the manor ostensibly to offer condolences to the household staff. The housekeeper, Mrs. Brooks, was a font of information, as most housekeepers were. Over a cup of tea in the kitchen, she confided that Miss Ellis had been acting strangely since the murder, staying late in the library, and avoiding the other staff. "She's a quiet one," Mrs. Brooks said, stirring her tea. "But I saw her crying the day after Mr. Hawthorne died. Said she felt responsible, though she wouldn't say why." Miss Marple nodded, her expression sympathetic. "Grief can be a heavy burden," she said, but her mind was elsewhere. Responsibility could mean many things: guilt, regret, or something deeper. She thanked Mrs. Brooks and made her way to the library, where the murder had taken place. The room was much as it had been described: large, oak-paneled, with tall windows overlooking the garden. The table where the dinner party had been held was still set, as if frozen in time. Miss Marple walked slowly around it, her eyes scanning the decanter, the remaining glasses, the chairs. She paused by the sideboard where the wine had been poured. It was a narrow space, easily accessible from the hallway, but also visible from the dining table. The killer would have needed to move quickly, unnoticed. She closed her eyes, picturing the scene: the guests laughing, the clink of glasses, the rustle of skirts as Miss Ellis moved between rooms. Someone had slipped the poison into the wine, then swapped the glass to avoid detection. It was a bold move, but not impossible. She thought of the village chemist, Mr. Hargreaves, who had once explained how cyanide could be concealed in a small vial, easily carried in a pocket or purse. As she left the manor, Miss Marple felt a familiar tingle of excitement. The pieces were beginning to align, though the picture was still incomplete. Tom's fingerprints, Miss Ellis's tears, Dr. Simmons's debts, Mrs. Langley's bitterness, Mr. Vance's flimsy alibis. They were all threads in the same tapestry. She just needed to find the one that would unravel it. Over the next few days, the village buzzed with new rumors. Tom had been questioned again, his alibi scrutinized. Dr. Simmons was seen leaving the village in a hurry, prompting speculation that he was fleeing. Mrs. Langley hosted a small gathering at her home, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to the village's unease. Mr. Vance, meanwhile, was spotted painting near the manor, his canvas depicting a stormy sky that seemed to mirror the village's mood. Miss Marple spent her evenings by the fire, case over in her mind. She thought of the reenactment Craddock was planning, a chance to recreate the dinner party and watch the guests' reactions. It was a bold move, but she approved. People often revealed themselves under pressure, their true natures slipping through the cracks of their carefully constructed facades. She thought, too, of the poison. Cyanide was not easy to come by, but it was not impossible. A doctor like Simmons would have access, but so might an artist like Vance, who used chemicals in his paints. Even Mrs. Langley, with her connections in the village, could have procured it, and Miss Ellis, quiet and unassuming, might have had her own secrets as the day of the reenactment approached. Miss Marple felt a growing certainty that the truth was within reach. The shadows of doubt that clouded the case were beginning to lift, revealing glimpses of the killer's identity. She would be ready, watching, listening, piecing together the final clues. The village of St. Mary Mead, with its quiet streets and hidden secrets, held the answers, and Miss Marple, with her sharp mind and keen understanding. Chapter 8. The Governess's Secret. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Marple's modest sitting room in St. Mary Mead, steaming gently on the table beside her, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she worked on a pale blue shawl. The village was still abuzz with talk of Mr. Reginald Hawthorne's death, and the mystery of the poisoned wine-glass had only deepened the scandal. Miss Marple's mind, however, was not on the gossip, but on the quiet. Like St. Mary Mead, where everyone's history was laid bare, like laundry on a line. Miss Ellis was a rare exception, a woman who kept her thoughts and feelings tightly guarded. Her timid demeanor, her soft voice, and her habit of averting her eyes when spoken to had not gone unnoticed by Miss Marple. There was something about the governess that reminded her of a young woman she had known years ago, a girl named Clara, who had worked as a housemaid in a neighboring village. Clara had been shy too, but her quietness had hidden a heart full of unspoken longing and, as it turned out, a secret that had nearly torn a family apart. Miss Marple wondered if Miss Ellis might be concealing something similar, something that could shed light on the dark events at Hawthorne Manor. The previous evening, Miss Marple had attended a small gathering at the vicarage, where the conversation had inevitably turned to the murder. Mrs. Price, the vicar's wife, had mentioned Miss Ellis in passing, noting how the governess had seemed particularly withdrawn since the tragedy. She barely spoke a word at the dinner party, they say, Mrs. Price had remarked, her voice tinged with sympathy. Poor thing, she must be dreadfully shaken. Miss Marple had nodded politely, but her mind had latched on to the comment. She resolved to pay Miss Ellis a visit, under the guise of offering comfort to a young woman in distress. The governess lived in a small cottage on the edge of the Hawthorne estate, a modest dwelling provided by Mr. Hawthorne for her services in educating his late sister's children, who had long since grown and moved away. Miss Marple set out after breakfast, her basket of knitting and a small jar of homemade blackberry jam in hand, a neighborly gift to ease the way into conversation. with the scent of honeysuckle lingering along the hedgerows. St. Mary Mead was at its most charming in such moments. Its green lanes and thatched roofs belying the secrets that sometimes lurked beneath its idyllic surface. When Miss Marple arrived at the cottage, she found Miss Ellis tending to a small flower bed, her hands busy with a tea thermometer rowel, though her movements were slow and distracted. The governess looked up, startled, as Miss Marple approached, her pale face flushing slightly. She was a slight woman, no older than 30, with mousy brown hair pinned neatly beneath a plain bonnet. Her gray eyes held a flicker of unease, but she managed a polite smile. "Good morning, Miss Ellis," Miss Marple said warmly, holding out the jar of jam. "I thought you might like a little something to brighten your day with all this dreadful business about—" "Oh, Miss Marple, how kind of you," Miss Ellis replied, her voice barely above a whisper. She wiped her hands on her apron and took the jar, her fingers trembling slightly. Would you like to come in for tea?" Miss Marple accepted the invitation with a nod, following Miss Ellis into the cottage. The interior was as modest as the exterior, with simple furnishings and a few books neatly arranged on a shelf. A small vase of wildflowers sat on the table, a touch of beauty in an otherwise unadorned space. Miss Ellis busied herself with the kettle, her movements precise but nervous, as if she were bracing herself for something. They sat together at the small table, the tea steaming between them. Miss Marple sipped delicately, her eyes gently observing the governess. "It's left you quite unsettled." Miss Ellis nodded, her gaze fixed on her teacup. "It was awful," she said quietly. "Mr. Hawthorne was— I've heard he was a kind man to those in his employ." The governess's cheeks flushed again, and she looked away, her fingers tightening around her cup. "He was generous," she said after a moment. "He allowed me to stay on here, even after the children no longer needed me. Not many would do that." There was a note in her voice, something wistful, almost tender, that caught Miss Marple's attention. She thought of Clara again, the housemaid who had loved a man above her station, a love that had led to heartbreak and, ultimately, a desperate act. Miss Marple decided to probe gently, as one might test the surface of a frozen pond. "It's a rare thing, such kindness," she said, her tone conversational. "I remember a young woman in St. Mary Mead some years ago, Clara, her name was who felt a great attachment to her employer. She kept it hidden, of course, but it weighed on her terribly. Love can be such a heavy burden when it's unspoken, don't you think?" Miss Ellis's head snapped up, her eyes wide with something akin to panic. I don't know what you mean," she stammered, setting her cup down with a clatter. "I didn't." Miss Marple smiled kindly, her eyes soft but piercing. "Of course, my dear, I didn't mean to suggest anything improper. It's only that I've seen how a kind gesture from someone like Mr. Hawthorne can mean so much to someone in your position. It's only natural to feel grateful." The governess seemed to relax slightly, though her hands remained clasped tightly in her lap. "He was kind," she said, her voice barely audible, "but I knew my place. I always knew my place." Miss Marple nodded, taking another sip of tea. She sensed that Miss Ellis was on the verge of revealing something, but she also knew that pushing too hard would cause the young woman to retreat further into her shell. Instead, she changed tack, steering the conversation toward the night of the murder. "It must have been such a shock, that dinner party," she said. "All those people, and no one noticing anything amiss with the wine. Clearing plates. I didn't notice anything unusual. It all happened so quickly. Did you handle the wine glasses yourself? Miss Marple asked, her tone light, as if the question were of no great importance. The governess hesitated, her fingers twitching. I poured some of the wine, yes, but I didn't touch Mr. Hawthorne's glass after it was set before him. I swear I didn't. Miss Marple's eyes flickered with interest, though her face remained serene. Of course, my dear. That glass disappearing, replaced with another. It makes one wonder who had the opportunity to make such a switch. Miss Ellis looked down at her hands, her voice trembling. I don't know. I wish I could help, but I don't know. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her voice gentle but firm. You mustn't be afraid, Miss Ellis. If there's anything you know, anything at all, it might make all the difference. Sometimes the smallest detail can shine a light on the truth. For a moment, the governess seemed to waver, her lips parting as if to speak. But then she shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. There's nothing, she whispered. I don't know anything. Miss Marple sat back, her knitting needles resuming their soft clicking. She didn't press further, sensing that Miss Ellis needed time to gather her courage. Instead, she finished her tea, thanked the governess for her hospitality, and took her leave, promising to call again soon. As she walked back through the village, her mind was alight with possibilities. Miss Ellis was hiding something, perhaps not the act of murder itself, but a piece of the puzzle that could lead to the truth. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple settled into her armchair once more, her knitting a comforting rhythm as she thought. The governess's reaction to the mention of love had been telling. It was not uncommon for a young woman in her position to develop feelings for a charismatic employer like Mr. Hawthorne. Had those feelings been reciprocated, or had they been a source of pain? And if Miss Ellis had loved him, could that love have turned to despair, even to something darker? Miss Marple thought back to the dinner party, piecing together the fragments of information she had gathered. The guests had all had access to the wine, but the act of poisoning required not just opportunity, but intent. Miss Ellis, with her quiet presence and her role in serving the wine, would have had the chance to tamper with the glass, but her demeanor suggested fear rather than guilt, and Miss Marple's instincts told her that the governess was not the calculating type. Still, her secret, whatever it was, could be a key to unlocking the mystery. The next day, Miss Marple attended a church service where she observed the villagers' interactions with keen interest. Miss Ellis was there, sitting alone in a back pew, her face pale and drawn. Dr. Simmons, the charming physician, was also present, chatting amiably with the vicar. Mrs. Langley, the aloof widow, sat stiffly in her usual pew, her eyes fixed on the altar. Tom Hawthorne, the ambitious nephew, was absent, likely still reeling from the suspicion cast upon him. And Mr. Vance, the eccentric artist, was nowhere to be seen, though Miss Marple had heard he was working on a new painting in his studio. After the service, Miss Marple lingered in the churchyard, exchanging pleasantries with her neighbors. Mrs. Price approached, her eyes bright with curiosity. Have you heard, Miss Marple? They say the inspectors are planning to question Miss Ellis again. Poor girl, she's so fragile. I can't imagine her mixed up in all this. Miss Marple smiled. Faintly, one never knows, Mrs. Price. People can surprise you, even the quiet ones. As she walked home, Miss Marple's thoughts returned to Miss Ellis. The governess's nervousness, her hesitation, her quick denial of any deeper connection to Whodunit, all pointed to a secret she was desperate to keep, Miss Marple recalled. Another case from years ago, when a young woman in St. Mary Mead had been blackmailed over a letter she had written to a man she loved. The letter had been innocent, but its discovery had led to ruin. Could Miss Ellis be protecting a similar secret? A letter, perhaps, or a conversation overheard something that made her fear exposure. Over the next few days, Miss Marple kept a discreet eye on Miss Ellis. She noticed the governess avoiding the village, keeping to her cottage except for brief errands. Once, Miss Marple saw her speaking with Dr. Simmons outside the chemist's shop, their conversation brief but intense. The doctor's face was grave, and Miss Ellis looked close to tears. Miss Marple filed the observation away, wondering if the doctor knew something about the governess's secret tour, if he, too, was hiding something. One evening, as Miss Marple sat by her window, she saw Miss Ellis walking toward the manor, her steps hesitant, curious. Miss Marple decided to follow at a distance, her curiosity outweighing her usual caution. The governess entered the manor through a side door, and Miss Marple, with the agility of someone accustomed to discreet observation, slipped into the garden to watch. Through a window, she saw Miss Ellis in the library, standing near the spot where Mr. Hawthorne had died. The governess was holding something, a small book or notebook, and her expression was one of anguish. Miss Marple's heart quickened. Was this the clue she had been waiting for? She made a mental note to speak with Inspector Craddock about the library, suggesting they search for any items Miss Ellis might have left behind. But she also knew that confronting the governess directly would yield little. Miss Ellis was too frightened to speak openly. Instead, Miss Marple decided to enlist the help of Mrs. Price, whose knack for gossip could be turned to good use. The next morning, Miss Marple invited Mrs. Price for tea, subtly steering the conversation toward Miss Ellis. "I do worry about her," Miss Marple said, her tone earnest. "She seems so alone, and with all this talk about the murder, I wonder if she's heard something that's troubling her. Perhaps you could have a word with her, Mrs. Price. A kind soul like you might help her open up." Mrs. Price, flattered by the request, agreed enthusiastically. "I'll call on her this afternoon," she promised. "If there's anything she knows, I'll coax it out of her." Miss Marple smiled, satisfied. She knew that Mrs. Price's well-meaning chatter would put Miss Ellis at ease, and with any luck, the governess might let slip a detail that would bring the truth to light. As she returned to her knitting, Miss Marple's mind was already piecing together the puzzle. Miss Ellis's secret, whatever it was tied to Mr. Hawthorne and, perhaps, to one of the other guests. The key was to find the connection, the thread that would unravel the web of motives and deceit. Over the next few days, Miss Marple continued her quiet observations, attending village events and listening to the gossip that swirled around the murder. She learned that Miss Ellis had been seen crying in the churchyard late one evening, and that Dr. Simmons had been asking questions about a certain type of poison at the chemist's shop. Mrs. Langley, meanwhile, had been overheard speaking sharply to Tom Hawthorne, accusing him of greed. And Mr. Vance, ever the eccentric, had painted a disturbing portrait of Mr. Hawthorne, which he refused to show anyone. Each piece of information was a thread in the tapestry Miss Marple was weaving. She thought of the dinner party, the wine glass, the motives and the secrets. Miss Ellis's love for Hawthorne, if it existed, could have been a motive for murder, or a reason to protect someone else. Dr. Simmons's lie about his whereabouts suggested he had something to hide, perhaps a financial desperation that had driven him to desperate measures. Mrs. Langley's bitterness, Tom's ambition, Mr. Vance's erratic behavior all were pieces of the puzzle, but none fit perfectly yet. Miss Marple decided to visit the manor herself, under the pretense of returning a book she had borrowed from Mr. Hawthorne's library. Inspector Craddock was there, looking frustrated as he sifted through papers on the late man's desk. "Miss Marple," he said, his tone weary, "I don't suppose you've any ideas about this missing glass. We've turned the place upside down, and there's no sign of it." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "It's a curious thing, isn't it, Inspector? A glass doesn't simply vanish. I wonder if you've checked the servants' quarters, or perhaps the garden shed. People do the strangest things when they're trying to hide something." Craddock raised an eyebrow, but he nodded. "I'll have a look, but I'm beginning to think this case will never be solved." "Nonsense, Inspector," Miss Marple said cheerfully. "Every puzzle has a solution. You just need to find the right piece." As she left the manor, Miss Marple's thoughts returned to Miss Ellis. The governess's secret was the key. She was certain of it. Whether it was love, fear, or something else entirely, it held the answer to the mystery of Mr. Hawthorne's death. And Miss Marple, with her keen eye and her deep understanding of human nature, was determined to uncover it. The days that followed were filled with small but significant discoveries. Mrs. Price reported that Miss Ellis had spoken vaguely of a letter she had written to Mr. Hawthorne, a letter she now feared might be found. Inspector Craddock discovered a vial of a rare poison in the manor's greenhouse, though no fingerprints were found, and Miss Marple, sitting quietly in her garden, overheard a conversation between two maids who mentioned seeing Miss Ellis lingering near the dining room after the dinner party, her hands shaking as she carried a tray. Each clue brought Miss Marple closer to the truth, but she knew she needed to be patient. The governess's secret would come to light, and with it, the identity of the killer. For now, she would continue to watch, to listen, and to knit, her mind as sharp as ever, piecing together the puzzle that had baffled even the best inspectors. As the sun set over St. Mary Mead, casting long shadows across the village, Miss Marple felt a quiet confidence. The truth was near, and with it, justice for Mr. Hawthorne. The governess's secret, whatever it was, would not remain hidden for long. Chapter 9. The artist's Alabitha morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Marple's modest cottage in St. Mary Mead, casting delicate patterns on the polished oak table where she sat with her knitting. Her fingers moved with practiced ease, the soft click of needles, a steady rhythm against the quiet hum of village life outside. But her mind was far from the scarf taking shape in her hands. It was fixed on Mr. Vance, the eccentric artist whose claim of painting in plein air during Mr. Hawthorne's murder had begun to fray at the edges like an old canvas dot. Mr. Vance, with his flamboyant scarves and paint-splattered smock, had always struck Miss Marple as a man who lived for attention as much as for art. His story of being outside the manor, capturing the twilight hues of the meadows, seemed plausible at first. St. Mary Mead's rolling fields were indeed a painter's dream, their golden greens and soft purples a lure for any artist's eye. But a witness, old Mrs. Clement, from the vicarage, had mentioned seeing a figure resembling Vance near the manor's side entrance around the time of the poisoning. The discrepancy gnawed at Miss Marple, much like a stitch dropped in her knitting, but enough to unravel the whole piece if not addressed. She set her needles down and sipped her tea, her sharp eyes drifting to the garden where sparrows flitted among the roses. Mr. Vance's behavior reminded her of a painter she'd known years ago in St. Mary Mead, a man named Mr. Phipps, who'd been all charm and flourish until his alibis crumbled under scrutiny. Phipps had claimed to be sketching by the river when a local jeweler's shop was burgled, but his paintbrushes were bone dry, and his boots carried the telltale mud of the shop's back alley. Pride, Miss Marple mused, often led such men to weave tales as vivid as their art, only to trip over the details. The village clock chimed 10, and Miss Marple gathered her shawl and basket, deciding to pay a visit to Mr. Vance's studio. It stood at the edge of St. Mary Mead, a converted barn cluttered with easels, half-finished canvases, and the sharp scent of turpentine. As she walked the cobbled path, she passed villagers exchanging hushed theories about the murder. "That artist fellow," muttered Mr. Bantry from the post office, "always seemed shifty to me. Too many colors in his wardrobe for a proper gentleman." Miss Marple smiled faintly. Village gossip, while often exaggerated, could hold grains of truth, like seeds scattered in a field. At the studio, Mr. Vance greeted her with a theatrical bow, his silk scarf fluttering like a peacock's tail. "Miss Marple, to what do I owe the pleasure? Come to commission a portrait, perhaps?" His voice was warm, but his eyes darted to the canvas he'd been working on, now hastily covered with a cloth. "Oh, nothing so grand, Mr. Vance," she replied, her tone mild as she settled into a wicker chair. "I was merely curious about your work. You were painting outside the manor the evening poor Mr. Hawthorne died, weren't you?" Vance's smile tightened just a fraction. "Indeed, I was. The light that evening was divine pink and gold, with a touch of violet in the clouds. I couldn't resist." He gestured toward a stack of canvases leaning against the wall. "Would you like to see the piece? It's nearly finished." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes scanning the room. The studio was a chaos of creativity brushes, scattered across a table, jars of pigment in every hue, and sketches pinned haphazardly to the walls. But something felt off, like a note played slightly out of tune. She rose and approached the covered canvas, her fingers brushing the cloth as Vance hurried to lift it. The painting depicted the meadows beyond the manor, the colors vivid and the composition striking. Yet, she noticed, the shadows. They fell at an angle, suggesting midday light, not the slanting rays of early evening when the murder occurred. Her mind flickered to a conversation with her nephew Raymond, an amateur painter, who'd once explained how light dictated a painting's mood. A true artist, she thought, would never mistake the sun's position so carelessly. "It's lovely," she said, her voice gentle, but her eyes keen. "Though I wonder, Mr. Vance, how you captured such bright shadows at twilight. The sun would have been much lower, wouldn't it?" Vance's hand paused mid-gesture, and for a moment his flamboyant air faltered. "Well, you see, Miss Marple, art takes liberties. I adjust the light for effect. Artistic license, you know." He laughed, but it was a brittle sound, like glass about to crack. Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of polite curiosity, of course, though it's curious, isn't it? Mrs. Clement mentioned seeing you near the manor's side entrance that evening. Perhaps you stepped away from your easel for a moment. The artist's face paled beneath his ruddy complexion. Mrs. Clement, that old gossip. Her eyes aren't what they used to be. I was painting, I assure you. He turned to rearrange a pile of sketches, his movements jerky. Besides, why would I be at the manor? I had no quarrel with Hawthorne, despite what some might say about that land deal. Miss Marple's interest sharpened at the mention of the land deal. Inspector Craddock had uncovered that Hawthorne had outbid Vance for a plot of land near the village, where Vance had hoped to build a grand studio. The loss had reportedly sent the artist into a rage, his dreams of a legacy dashed. "Oh yes, the land," she said, as if it were an afterthought. "It must have been disappointing to lose it. I recall a young man in St. Mary Mead, years ago, who held a grudge over a similar matter. He went to great lengths to settle the score." Vance's eyes narrowed, but he recovered quickly, his smile returning like a mask. "Grudges are for small minds, Miss Marple. I've moved on. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a canvas to finish." She thanked him and left, her mind buzzing as she walked back through the village. The discrepancy in the painting's shadows, combined with Mrs. Clement's sighting, suggested Vance's alibi was as flimsy as the cloth over his canvas. But was it enough to mark him as the killer? Poison required planning, not just opportunity, and Vance's impulsive nature didn't quite fit the careful execution of swapping a wineglass. Still, his pride, his need to be seen as untouchable, could have driven him to lie. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple settled into her armchair, her knitting resumed, but her thoughts elsewhere. She recalled a conversation with Inspector Craddock, who'd mentioned finding a trace of paint on the manor's dining room floor near where the decanter stood. It was a faint smudge, easily overlooked, but the colorer, vibrant ultramarine, matched the pigments scattered in Vance's studio. Could he have slipped into the dining room during the chaos of the dinner party, perhaps to tamper with the wine? The thought lingered, heavy as the scent of turpentine. The next day, Miss Marple joined Inspector Craddock and Chief Inspector Langley at the manor, where they were re-examining the scene. The dining room, with its long mahogany table and crystal chandelier, still held the echo of that fateful evening. Craddock, his brow furrowed, was discussing the missing wineglass. "It's the devil of it," he said. "Whoever swapped it knew exactly what they were doing. No fingerprints, no trace, except that smudge of paint." Miss Marple's eyes brightened. "Paint, you say? What color was it, Inspector?" "Blue," Craddock replied, flipping through his notebook. "Bright blue, almost unnatural." Langley thought it might be from an artist's palette. Langley, pacing near the window, nodded. "Could be nothing, of course. The manor's full of odd marks, but it's the only clue we've got that doesn't point to young Tom Hawthorne." Miss Marple said nothing, but her mind was racing. She pictured Vance, his hands stained with paint, moving through the dining room in a moment of distraction. Perhaps he'd brushed against the table while swapping the glass, leaving that telltale smudge. But why? The land deal was a motive, certainly, but it felt too petty for murder. Or was it? She remembered a St. Mary Mead grocer who'd once sabotaged a rival's shop over a smaller slight. His pride wounded beyond reason. "Miss Marple," Craddock said, interrupting her thoughts, "you've been quiet. Got any of your village parallels for us. She smiled, her eyes twinkling behind her spectacles. Oh, just a thought, Inspector. There was a painter in St. Mary Mead once, a proud man who'd rather lie than admit he'd been somewhere he shouldn't. His stories were as colorful as his canvases, but they unraveled when you looked closely at the details. Craddock raised an eyebrow. You think Vance is lying? I think, she said carefully, that Mr. Vance's pride may have painted him into a corner. But whether that corner hides a murderer, I'm not yet certain. The inspectors exchanged a glance, accustomed by now to Miss Marple's cryptic insights. Langley, less familiar with her methods, looked skeptical but said nothing. They agreed to question Vance again, this time at the station, where his flair for drama might falter under pressure. That afternoon, Miss Marple took a stroll past the meadows where Vance claimed to have painted. The view was indeed stunning, the light soft and golden even now. She paused, imagining an easel set up among the wildflowers, and tried to picture Vance's movements that evening. Had he been here, as he said, or had he slipped back to the manor, driven by some hidden grudge? The land deal, she thought, was only part of the puzzle. Vance's pride, his need to be seen as above the fray, might have pushed him to actor, to cover for someone else. She recalled a moment at the dinner party, mentioned by the housekeeper, when Vance had spilled wine on his cuff and laughed it off, claiming clumsiness. Had that been a distraction, a way to move near the decanter unnoticed? The housekeeper had also noted Vance's habit of lingering near the dining room's side door, as if waiting for someone. Miss Marple filed the detail away, her mind weaving connections like threads in her knitting. Back at the village hall, where the inspectors had set up their temporary headquarters, Miss Marple found Vance being questioned. His voice carried through the open window, indignant and theatrical. I tell you, I was painting. Why would I harm Hawthorne? The man was a Philistine, but I don't kill over bad taste. Craddock's voice was calm but firm. Then explained the paint on the dining room floor, Mr. Vance. Ultramarine, just like the kind you use. And Mrs. Clement's sighting of you near the manor. Your story doesn't add up, Vance sputtered, his composure slipping. That old woman's half-blind, and the paint, why, it could have come from anywhere. The manor's full of artists and decorators. Miss Marple, listening from the hall, noted the desperation in his tone. It was the same note she'd heard in Mr. Phipps all those years ago, when he'd been caught out in a lie. She stepped into the room, her presence quiet but commanding, and addressed Vance directly. Mr. Vance, you're a man of detail, aren't you? Your paintings are meticulous, yet your alibi is curiously vague. Why not tell us what you were really doing near the manor that evening? Vance's eyes widened, and for a moment he seemed caught like a fox in a trap. But he recovered, his voice rising. I've told you, I was painting. You've no proof otherwise. Miss Marple smiled, unruffled. Proof is a curious thing, Mr. Vance. It's often in the smallest details, a shadow in a painting, a smudge of paint, a witness's memory. They add up, you see, like stitches in a pattern. She left the room, leaving Vance visibly shaken and the inspectors intrigued. Outside, she paused to adjust her shawl, her mind still turning over the pieces of the puzzle. Vance's alibi was weak, but was he the killer, or merely a man hiding something else? Perhaps he'd seen something that night, something he feared to admit. Or perhaps his pride had led him to a darker act, one he now regretted as the day Faded into evening, Miss Marple returned to her cottage, her thoughts as intricate as the lace on her table. She picked up her knitting, the needles clicking softly, and considered the other guests, Dr. Simmons, with his debts, Mrs. Langley, with her bitterness, Miss Ellis, with her quiet love, and Tom, with his inheritance. Each had a motive, each a secret. But Vance's flamboyant lies stood out, like a splash of ultramarine on a clean canvas. She would watch him closely, she decided, as the village settled into its quiet night. The truth, like a painting, would reveal itself in time, one careful brush-stroke at a time. And Miss Marple, with her sharp eyes and sharper mind, would be there to see it.